48 years ago, a 5-year-old girl vanished right in front of her house on a peaceful afternoon in Bend, Oregon, disappearing without a trace and leaving her family shattered in despair. Authorities suspected a man who lived nearby, who appeared at exactly the time Grace went missing. But with no body found, no solid evidence, and too few leads to pursue, the investigation quickly stalled. Yet, through all those long years, one mother never gave up hope, clinging to the slim chance that her daughter was still out there somewhere, living under a name she had never heard. And then one day, when modern DNA technology was deployed, a small overlooked detail from 1977 suddenly emerged. A detail powerful enough to change the entire case and shock everyone who had ever been involved. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you like the video, don't forget to subscribe. In June 1977, Bend, Oregon still had the feel of a quiet mountain town, where kids played outside until dark and the red dirt roads running through sparsely populated neighborhoods rarely saw anything unusual. The Howard family lived in a small wooden house at the end of Alder Lane. Robert worked at a lumber mill, Elaine taught at the nearby elementary school, and Grace, the 5-year-old blonde girl with a lopsided ponytail, who always carried a small rock she had picked up in the yard, was the center of that little world. That afternoon, the late sunlight spread across the front yard. Robert was repairing a rotted section of fence. Elaine was preparing dinner in the kitchen, and Grace was running around with her red plastic hoop. Lydia Cooper, the 16-year-old neighbor girl trusted by the family, had come over to watch Grace while Elaine cooked, leaning against the porch and occasionally tilting her head to check on what Grace was doing. Everything was normal until Lydia noticed a strange man standing at the end of the street. Thin build, wearing a baseball cap, glancing over briefly before turning away. Behind him, a brown Plymouth Voyager parked crookedly at the edge of the road with the passenger side window cracked open. The neighbor's brown and black dog started barking in that direction, making Lydia feel a momentary unease. But she reassured herself that strangers sometimes passed through the small street, asking for directions. Grace was still playing near the steps, occasionally looking up toward the gate, while Lydia stepped closer to the door to hear Elaine calling from the kitchen. Just 6 seconds, the time it takes to gently close a door or bend down to tie a shoelace. When Lydia turned back to look at the yard, Grace was no longer there. The front yard was empty, Grace's red plastic hoop lying on the ground spinning as if still holding her last movement. Lydia rushed down the steps, calling Grace's name repeatedly. Robert dropped his tools and ran along the fence. Elaine burst out from the kitchen with her face turning pale. The whole family spread out across the yard, to the neighbors' houses, around the bushes, opening every garage door in the area, calling out in the hope that Grace was just hiding somewhere in a whimsical game like any child. Neighbors heard the shouts and came over to help, fanning out to search the bushes, shining flashlights into dark corners as the daylight faded. No one found any sign of Grace, no response, no sound of running footsteps. A chill ran down Elaine's spine as she stood in the middle of the yard, realizing the small space where her daughter had just been was now completely swallowed up. As minutes passed without any sign of Grace, Elaine knew this disappearance could not be just an ordinary momentary wander. Unable to wait any longer, she rushed inside, picked up the phone with trembling hands, and dialed 911. Her voice choking as she reported that her 5-year-old daughter had vanished right in front of the house in just a few short seconds. The call was received by the Bend 911 center at 7:12 p.m. Elaine's voice was so panicked that the operator had to ask her to repeat the information 3 times to ensure they understood the nature of the incident correctly. After verifying the basic details, victim's name, age, address, and last seen time, the operator entered the report into the system as missing juvenile. Initial report, a medium priority level since no signs of assault, screams, or any violent activity had been noted. The report was immediately dispatched to the Bend Police Department's radio, and the nearest patrol unit was assigned within less than a minute. Meanwhile, at the scene, Robert and a few neighbors continued searching the surroundings, calling Grace's name, checking storage sheds behind houses, while Lydia stood frozen on the porch, panicked and trying to remember how long she had turned away. 6 minutes after the 911 call, the sound of a patrol car engine echoed at the corner of Alder Lane. 2 officers stepped out, quickly surveying the entire area before approaching Elaine, who was nearly too hysterical to answer coherently. They asked everyone to stop searching and return to the front yard area, but the small crowd had already spread to the fence at the end of the street, leaving the ground covered in overlapping footprints and virtually eliminating any chance of identifying original traces. One officer noted quickly in his notebook that scene no longer intact, while the other asked Robert about the final moments before Grace vanished. Since there were no physical signs of a struggle, loud noises, or someone running away, the officers temporarily classified the case as missing child under unclear circumstances, not yet determining the possibility of abduction. They asked neighbors to step back, but did not establish a perimeter or seal off the area. No police tape was put up, no one was assigned to protect potential last-seen locations of Grace, and no scene map was created at that time. People continued unconsciously walking across the yard, the forest edge, around the plastic hoop lying on the ground, further disturbing the surface. One officer tried to look for footprints or tire tracks, but found nothing clear because the dirt had been trampled. The initial efforts focused only on collecting scattered statements, noting Lydia's description of the strange man in the brown van at the end of the street. But since Lydia was too upset and could not recall clear details about the face or license plate, the information was marked as insufficient reliability. As the light grew dim and the temperature began to drop, the officers asked the family to return to the front yard to compile the entire incident, estimated time of disappearance, possible direction Grace might have gone, and whether anyone in the family heard any unusual sounds. The first report the lead officer entered into the system did not mention kidnapping, but only potential wandering or unobserved departure, reflecting the assessment at that time that Grace might have left the yard on her own. This decision, along with not establishing a perimeter and not preserving traces, allowed the critical first minutes of the investigation to pass in a state of lack of control. The patrol car remained parked at the end of the street with flashing lights. Neighbors gathered at the roadside, the Howard family stood close together in the yard, and the 2 officers tried to organize the chaotic information before them, while unaware that they were inadvertently walking over traces that might have explained what happened to Grace just minutes earlier. It was in that chaotic context that the Bend Police Department's on-scene commander, Lieutenant Nathan Reese, arrived at Alder Lane about 10 minutes after the first patrol unit. He stepped out of the command SUV carrying a file bag, multi-channel radio and neighborhood map, while requesting all officers to give a quick status report. After receiving preliminary information that the area had been significantly disturbed, no longer in original condition, and no elements indicating direct violence, Reese conducted a quick assessment following standard procedures at the time, confirming the last seen time of Grace, confirming the number of people present in the area since the disappearance, and identifying key observation points in the yard. Based on the initial 911 report and the still fragmented accounts from Elaine and Lydia, Reese temporarily classified the case as missing juvenile, unknown circumstances, an intermediate category, allowing authorities to continue investigating without labeling it abduction or voluntary departure. One of his first decisions was to separate each group of people to prevent them from influencing each other's statements. Lydia was taken to a patrol car parked to the left of the Howard house to sit separately. Elaine and Robert were kept in the yard, but asked not to discuss further details with neighbors, and residents who had participated in the initial search were directed to step back from the area and wait for statements later. Once personnel were stabilized, Reese ordered an officer to compile a list of everyone present at or near the time of Grace's disappearance. Family members, direct witnesses, indirect witnesses, passers-by, anyone who had spoken to the family earlier that day, and anyone reporting seeing vehicles or strangers in the area. This list was prioritized, with Lydia ranked first as the last person to see Grace, followed by Elaine and Robert, to establish household activity. Secondary witnesses like Mr. Palmer and Mrs. Jensen noted for verification, and finally other residents with only general information. After the list was complete, Reese pulled the area map from his file bag, spread it out on the hood of the command SUV, and marked all spaces related to the disappearance. Grace's last play location, Lydia's position before turning away, where the plastic hoop was found, areas searched by family and neighbors, the path to the main road, the tree line behind the fence, and the reported location of the brown Plymouth Voyager. Officers were grouped around the map to ensure everyone understood the initial layout. Reese circled 3 priority areas immediately adjacent to the porch where Grace was last seen, the street section in front of the house where the van was observed, and the open land behind the fence where an unnoticed escape route might exist. He also noted clearly that any details added to the map must have verified sources, not based on anyone's speculation. At the same time, to ensure information collection did not fall back into chaos like when the first unit arrived, Reese established a short reporting cycle. Each officer handling interviews or search areas had to update him every 30 minutes or immediately, if new information exceeded the initial scope. Once witness separation, case classification, and preliminary mapping were complete, he assigned an officer to log all this data into the official scene report to ensure the first steps of the investigation were accurately recorded. All these steps took place as outdoor light faded quickly and neighbors still gathered at the end of the street, but Reese maintained his approach, stabilize the area, collect uncontaminated information, and establish a clear investigative structure to avoid repeating early mistakes. Although many points remained unverified, especially the exact timeline of Grace's disappearance and the potential involvement of the strange man at the end of the street, the initial assessment setup and task assignments helped reshape the entire investigative framework, replacing the initial minutes of chaos with a structured process. Once positions and tasks were stabilized, Lieutenant Reese immediately moved to the next step, collecting statements from direct witnesses. Under his direction, 2 officers were assigned to start with Lydia, the last person to see Grace before she vanished. She was placed in the patrol car to isolate her from the crowd and prevent unconsciously adjusting her account based on adult reactions around her. The interviewing officer asked Lydia to describe the entire sequence from when she came over to watch Grace until discovering the child was no longer in the yard. Lydia said she had been watching Grace most of the time and only turned away for a brief moment when hearing Elaine call from the house, then turned back and no longer saw Grace. When asked specifically how long she turned away, Lydia estimated 3 to 6 seconds, but could not be certain due to panic. Next, the officer moved to the description of the stranger Lydia remembered seeing shortly before. Lydia said, "The man at the end of the street was tall, wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap." When asked about the face, she said she could not see clearly due to distance and fading dusk light. She only remembered the feeling that he was looking toward the house, but could not confirm if his gaze was on Grace. Regarding the van, Lydia described it as brown, old, with the passenger window down, front facing the main road out of the neighborhood. When the officer asked for license plate or distinctive marks, Lydia immediately shook her head as she had not observed closely enough. The officer recorded the entire account, marking high uncertainty due to emotional distress and very brief exposure to the stranger. After finishing Lydia's portion, the next step was statements from Elaine and Robert, each taken separately to ensure independence. Elaine was moved to a quieter spot in the yard, beside the back door to avoid distraction. When asked to recount the timeline before calling 911, Elaine said the afternoon had been normal. She was preparing dinner, Lydia watching Grace in the front yard, and no unusual sounds or signs from the street. When asked if she heard engine starting, doors closing, or strange footsteps, Elaine said no, though she admitted the kitchen was near an inner window, so outside sounds might have been muffled. Elaine described Lydia's state when reporting Grace missing as panicked, almost unable to speak, which matched the officer's observations upon arrival. Robert was interviewed in the left yard corner, where he was helping an officer reconstruct fence and path positions. Robert said he was repairing the fence, so occasionally not looking toward the front yard, and only learned of the disappearance when hearing Lydia scream. When asked about strangers or suspicious vehicles, Robert said he saw no one, as he was mostly bent over checking nails and wood. However, he did recall the neighbor's dog barking toward the street a few minutes earlier, but paid no attention, thinking it normal. After collecting full statements from all three, the officers began cross-comparing information. Both Lydia and Elaine confirmed the front yard was not crowded before the incident, ruling out a group gathering or close approach without notice. Lydia and Robert both noted the dog barking toward the main street, matching the van location Lydia described, though Robert did not see the vehicle due to obstructed view. The time Lydia saw the stranger and when she turned away overlapped in the last half hour before disappearance, but no evidence directly linked the events. All three confirmed Grace had no habit of running to the street or going far from the yard without an adult. This strengthened the assessment that voluntary departure was unlikely. For the stranger and van description, Lydia's account was the sole source, unconfirmed by Elaine or Robert. Due to distant observation and short duration, officers marked the statement value as initial directional, meaning useful to open investigative angles, but not solid evidence. In the interim report, the officer summarized, Lydia provided important information on stranger and suspicious vehicle, but accuracy unclear. Elaine provided household context and ruled out unusual sounds. Robert provided surrounding environment and animal reaction details. All three agreed on a very narrow disappearance window. All this data was forwarded to Lieutenant Reese for incorporation into the map and temporary timeline being built on the command vehicle hood. When the direct interviews with Lydia, Elaine, and Robert concluded, Reese immediately gathered all the notes submitted by the officers, preparing to move to the next phase, reconstructing a detailed timeline for the final 90 minutes before Grace disappeared. This was a critical step to determine if there were any gaps in the schedule that could have allowed an individual to approach the front yard area undetected. Reese spread the neighborhood map over the hood of the command vehicle, placed the three interview transcripts side by side, and began marking each event in chronological order. Information from Elaine indicated that dinner preparation began around 5:10 p.m., and during that time, she only left the kitchen twice to check on Grace, at approximately 5:25 and 5:50. Lydia confirmed her presence in the front yard at 5:30 and stated that Grace continuously played within about 10 feet of the porch steps. Robert reported that he started repairing the fence around 5:15, spending nearly the entire time until close to 6:40, replacing 3 rotted boards and checking the nails. Reese clearly marked on the map the movements of each person, Elaine in the kitchen, Robert at the left fence, and Lydia in the front yard. The period when Grace was most likely near the street area only occurred from 6:20 onward, when Lydia occasionally moved between the porch and a position near the right fence to watch the child playing with a plastic hoop near the grass. Both Lydia and Robert were consistent about hearing the neighbor's dog barking toward the main road between approximately 6:25 and 6:30, so Reese marked this time frame as a notable auditory marker. According to Lydia's statement, she saw the strange man at the end of the street about 5 to 10 minutes before hearing Elaine call, placing that sighting around 6:30 to 6:32. Regarding the brown van, Lydia could not pinpoint the exact time it appeared, only saying it was already parked there when she noticed the man, so Reese noted this as an open unfixed time interval, but still marked the van as appearing before 6:32. All these markers were layered onto the map as independent datasets, then overlaid to identify intersections. Upon cross-referencing, Reese noted that from 6:32 onward, Lydia was positioned just a few steps from Grace until Elaine called her from the kitchen, a detail confirmed by both Lydia and Elaine. From hearing the call to turning back, Lydia estimated 3 to 6 seconds, while Elaine confirmed Lydia responded very quickly and did not leave the porch area for long. This 3 to 6 second window was the point Reese circled on the timeline and labeled blind window, meaning the period of lost direct supervision. This was the only interval in which Grace could have been taken without anyone witnessing it, so Reese placed special emphasis on verifying the accuracy of this duration. He instructed the assigned officer to follow up with Lydia about the lighting conditions, the direction she turned, and her steps when leaving the porch to ensure no factors were overlooked. Additional details confirmed that Lydia did not move beyond the porch area, meaning she did not lose sight of Grace longer than she had stated. Next, Reese shifted to creating a diagram of Grace's movements in the final 90 minutes. Based on the statements, Grace primarily played within a 5 to 10 foot radius around the porch steps, then moved slightly toward the right fence to pick something up from the ground before returning near the porch. The location where the plastic hoop was found was offset toward the main road, about 2 or 3 steps from where Lydia was standing, and was marked on the map as Grace's final known position. Reese combined the hoop's location, the direction of the dog's barking, and the statement about the man at the end of the street to form a single suspected path connecting the front yard to the main road. However, since there were no footprints, drag marks, or any displacement traces in the yard due to the scene being disturbed, he assessed that this path could not be confirmed and should only be considered an initial hypothetical direction. After completing the data overlay, Reese began building a single integrated timeline for the entire event. From 5 o'clock to 5:30, the household operated normally. From 5:30 to 6:20, Grace played in the yard under Lydia's supervision. From 6:20 to 6:30, Robert remained at the fence, Elaine in the kitchen, and Lydia observed Grace at regular intervals. From 6:30 to 6:32, Lydia saw the strange man and the brown van. From 6:32 to 6:38, the situation showed no clear changes. 6:38 to 6:44 was the critical period when Lydia turned her back for a few seconds and discovered Grace missing immediately afterward. Finally, from 6:44 to 7:12 was the phase when the family searched on their own, without authorities. With the integrated timeline complete, Reese circled 3 key points: the man's appearance, the location where the plastic hoop was found, and the 3 to 6 second blind supervision window. All these elements were labeled core elements, the foundational components for determining the next investigative direction. Reese closed the file folder, noting that the timeline was sufficiently substantiated for use, and signaled the officers to prepare for the next step: spatial analysis based on these timestamps, ensuring the entire subsequent investigation rested on a unified and non-overlapping data foundation. With the integrated timeline completed, Lieutenant Reese immediately moved to the next task: cordoning off the scene to define the spatial range potentially directly related to Grace's disappearance. He directed 2 officers to lay out tape measures and laser distance devices around the Howard's front yard, starting from the porch steps where Grace was last playing, then expanding to the left fence, right fence, the edge of the main road, and the open area leading to the wooded edge behind. Measurements were taken precisely segment by segment, recording the distance from Grace's position to the main road as approximately 22 feet, to the right fence 11 feet, to the left fence 14 feet, and to the intersection with the side path on the right as 17 feet. These figures were marked directly on the neighborhood map. When cross-referencing the measurements with the 3 to 6 second unsupervised window, Reese requested calculations of how far Grace could have moved on her own, if running, or how quickly an adult could have carried her away. Based on the average running speed of a 5-year-old, in 6 seconds Grace could have moved at most about 18 to 20 feet, meaning she could not have run to the main road and continued farther before Lydia turned back. Conversely, if an adult carried Grace, the 22-foot distance from the yard to the road edge could easily be covered in under 4 seconds. This made the path from Grace's last position to the main road the priority route in the scene diagram. Next, Reese identified feasible entry-exit points based on the terrain. The first was the main road in front of the house. The second was the narrow path on the right side, leading to the sparse woods. And the third was a small gap between fence sections on the left. The first exit was rated highest probability because that was where Lydia saw the brown van between 6:30 and 6:32, and also the direction the neighbor's dog barked. The second exit was considered a potential route due to limited visibility in the sparse woods and ease of concealing short movements. However, this path had relatively soft soil, and due to the initial spontaneous search disturbing the surface, no signs remained to confirm a clear direction of movement. The third exit was less likely as it was obscured by bushes, and no one reported seeing anyone enter or exit there. After evaluating the three exits, Reese directed the assigned officer to calculate the maximum distance a four-wheeled vehicle could travel from the moment Grace disappeared until the first patrol unit arrived on scene. Assuming a vehicle left Alder Lane immediately at low speed to avoid drawing attention in the residential area, it could cover about 0.4 to 0.6 miles in 3 minutes. Thus, in the 6 minutes from disappearance to police arrival, the vehicle could have left the entire residential area and reached major roads. This calculation was used to define the initial search radius, encompassing all roads within a 1-mile radius and small roadside parking areas commonly used for short stops. Concurrently, another officer measured sightline obstructions around the yard to determine if any blind spots could have been exploited by a perpetrator to approach Grace without Lydia seeing. Results highlighted 2 prominent blind spots, one at the right fence corner where bushes grew thickly, and one in the narrow strip on the left where the fence met the neighbor's garage. These locations were marked on the diagram for further detailed checks. Reese continued cordoning the scene by layering areas by priority. Layer 1 was the yard itself, Layer 2 the 30-foot perimeter around the fences, Layer 3 the entire block, and Layer 4 the roads that could lead out of the residential area within the first 6 minutes. Each layer was assigned a unique code for search assignment and data collection. Once all measurements were recorded, Reese created a complete scene diagram, clearly marking each entry-exit, relevant distances, and areas to sweep. He noted that these parameters would dictate the sequence of searches and information gathering. At the conclusion of the assessment phase, Reese determined that the search radius must be expanded to cover all roads adjacent to Alder Lane and the 1-mile radius, the maximum distance any vehicle could have traveled before police appeared. Once the scene cordoning diagram was completed, he immediately shifted forces to the next step, initiating the first phase search, systematically sweeping the entire yard, garden and wooded edge, using a grid method to detect any traces of movement, dropped items or unusual disturbances that Grace might have left. One team of officers was assigned to create parallel grid lines spaced 3 feet apart, starting from the front porch steps and moving step by step toward the left fence, then returning and continuing toward the right fence, ensuring the entire ground surface was covered evenly without missing any hidden corners. The grid search was then expanded to the entire front garden area, including spots that neighbors and family had inadvertently trampled before authorities arrived, because even though original traces were gone, meticulously examining each section could still reveal buried objects, small drag marks, or items Grace might have been holding before disappearing. The sweep of the front yard revealed no signs that Grace had run out on her own, no small footprint trails toward the road, no long skid marks, no scraped soil patches or grass smeared in a direction of movement. One officer found a slightly depressed area, about 4 feet from the plastic hoops location, but after cross-referencing with the initial chaotic family and neighbor search, it was concluded to most likely be an adult footprint. The next team moved to the right garden area, where the small path led to the wooded edge and was marked as the second exit on the scene map. There, officers continued the grid from the right fence to a large tree about 12 feet away. The soil surface here was soft and could retain traces, but since many residents had followed this path while searching for Grace shortly after her disappearance, the ground was almost entirely trampled, making it impossible to distinguish traces originating from Grace versus adults. However, the search team noted no children's items left behind, no fabric scraps, no toys, and importantly, no continuous small footprint chain leading deeper into the woods. One officer observed that if Grace had run this way on her own, even if later trampled, there would likely be children's shoe prints or low-level soil disturbances corresponding to a 5-year-old's height, but nothing matched. From the wooded edge, the search team extended the grid another 10 feet into thicker bushes, per standard first-phase protocol. Despite thorough searching, they found no indications that Grace had entered this area. The entire sparse wooded area near the house was concluded to show no signs of independent child movement. When the grid search spread to the left side of the yard, adjacent to the narrow strip between the fence and the neighbor's garage, results were similar. Soil disturbed by adults, no small-sized footprints, no dropped objects, and no evidence Grace had stood or passed there in the final moments. The search team noted that any direction Grace could have gone on her own would need to leave at least some trace matching a child's foot size or reflecting low-height movement, but no location met this criterion. In the interim summary report, the search team agreed that the entire area within reasonable movement range for Grace during the 3 to 6 second unsupervised window had been fully covered, with no evidence she left the yard independently. Reese requested a final recheck of the plastic hoop location and surrounding area to verify any signs of Grace being dragged or tripping before disappearing, but the ground there also showed no compatible disturbances. The complete absence of Grace's movement traces, combined with the previously calculated distance parameters, led Reese to a preliminary conclusion that it was highly unlikely she left the yard on her own in that brief time frame. When the first phase search team definitively reported no foot movement traces from Grace across the entire yard, garden and wooded edge, Reese immediately shifted focus to another direction, gathering statements from additional witnesses waiting to be interviewed at the end of Alder Lane. The first additional witness, temporarily designated Witness #2, was Mr. Harold Palmer, who lived 2 houses down from the Howards, and reported seeing a strange man near the main road area during the period overlapping when Grace was still playing outside. Mr. Palmer stated that between approximately 6:25 and 6:30, while watering plants in his front yard, he noticed a man leaning against a utility pole near the corner of Alder Lane and Birchwood Court. The man wore a dark blue denim jacket, dark pants, and a baseball cap pulled low. Mr. Palmer confirmed the man did not enter any house and simply stood still, glancing around the street before looking down as if tying his shoe or picking something up. When asked if he saw this person interact with anyone or approach the Howard house, he said no, emphasizing that lighting was starting to fade, so he could not clearly see the man's face. However, he clearly recalled the stranger appearing before he heard the neighbor's dog barking, prompting Reese to mark Palmer's sighting time as approximately 6:25 to 6:28. Palmer's statement was noted as independent since he had not spoken with Lydia or the Howard family beforehand, increasing its value for cross-referencing with the integrated timeline. While Witness #2's statement was being finalized, another team of officers approached Witness #3, Mrs. Joan Jensen, who lived in the house facing the direction of the van Lydia described. Mrs. Jensen reported that between approximately 6:35 and 6:40, while taking trash to the curbside bin, she saw a woman standing next to a dark-colored van, parked near the road edge, in front of the residential area. According to Mrs. Jensen, the woman was average height, wearing a light-colored coat, with brown hair tied back, and standing slightly bent toward the right rear door of the van. What caught her attention was the woman's motion as if lifting or holding something with both hands, but since the trash bin and van obstructed her view, she could not determine if it was a child. When asked about timing, she confirmed it was getting dark and she was only outside for a few seconds before returning inside, so she did not know when the van left. Mrs. Jensen's description differed completely from Lydia's, not only in the gender of the person by the van, but also in appearance, time, and clothing details. Reese directed that both witnesses' statements be incorporated into the new combined timeline, placing the 6:25, 6:28 sighting for the denim-clad man and 6:35, 6:40 for the woman by the van. The officers noted the statements were at least 7 minutes apart, sufficient to not rule out the possibility of two separate individuals. However, since Lydia insisted the man she saw appeared very close to the moment she heard Elaine call, while Jensen reported seeing the woman afterward, the overall timing made linking the two witnesses difficult. Using event timing analysis methods, the investigation team marked Palmer's statement as an early marker and Jensen's as a late marker, creating a time corridor from 6:25 to 6:40, during which at least two strangers were reported in the area. When officers probed further about the van's position, Jensen pointed to a spot pulled to the curb, near the area Lydia also described. However, the color details differed. Lydia said brown. Jensen said dark but unsure if brown or gray. Reese flagged this as unreliable color consistency due to dusk lighting easily causing confusion. The biggest inconsistency was in the description of the person associated with the van. Lydia recalled a man at the street end, while Jensen recalled a woman by the vehicle. To assess the information's value, Reese directed the assigned officer to analyze conflicting factors, determining if the two statements could describe the same subject with mistaken gender, or two different subjects. Comparing viewing angles, exposure times, observation positions, and distances, the preliminary conclusion was that the likelihood of two separate individuals was higher. This split the investigative direction into two branches, the first focusing on the denim-clad man present just before Grace's disappearance, the second on the woman by the van a few minutes after the disappearance. Another complicating factor was timing error in the witnesses' memories. Palmer did not check a clock and relied on his watering routine, while Jensen timed it based on taking trash out before dinner. These reference frames could be off by 5 to 10 minutes, making the event interval even harder to pin down. After compiling all statements, Lieutenant Reese evaluated the information using 3 criteria: witness independence, internal consistency in statements, and verifiability with physical evidence. Both witnesses were independent and provided non-overlapping details, but lacked time consistency and physical corroboration. Thus, the statements were classified as investigative leads rather than established evidence. Reese clearly noted in the report that if both witnesses were truthful, in the final 15 minutes before Grace disappeared, at least 2 strangers appeared near the Howard House Road area, a man and a woman, along with 1 van or 2 similar vehicles. This complicated the initial hypothesis of a lone stranger. To avoid over-reliance on any unverified statements, he directed keeping the 2 investigative paths separate, awaiting cross-referencing with additional data after completing area sweeps and checking other sources potentially related to the presence of 1 or more strangers on Alder Lane at the exact time of Grace's disappearance. After completing the recording of statements from the 2 additional witnesses, which contained numerous mismatched timelines and led the investigation to split into 2 independent branches, Lieutenant Reese shifted to evaluating individuals living in the area who might be connected to Grace's disappearance, starting with the subject deemed most noteworthy based on criteria of proximity, presence during the relevant time, and behavior that could facilitate an opportunity for contact. Ethan Markley, a single man in his 30s, living alone in a house 2 doors east of the Howard family. Ethan was placed on the initial evaluation list not due to any direct evidence pointing to involvement, but because his home was located directly on a feasible route connecting Grace's last known position to gate number 1 leading to the main road. When 2 officers knocked on Ethan's door to begin gathering information, Ethan was cooperative and allowed them to inspect the living room, kitchen, and backyard. He stated that he had returned home around 4 p.m. after his shift at a mechanic shop in North Bend and remained home for the rest of the evening. When asked about the last time he stepped into the yard or accessed the front area, Ethan said he went out to the porch briefly to get the mail around 5:45, then stayed inside reassembling a small electronic component until he heard screaming from the Howard house, but he did not immediately run outside because he assumed it was a family matter. However, the times for retrieving the mail and hearing the noise were not confirmed by a clock, but based solely on his sense of time, requiring this data to be flagged as unverifiable. When the officer asked if anyone could confirm his presence at home between 6 o'clock and 6:45, Ethan stated that he lived alone and no one visited during that period. This left his alibi without independent witnesses. One officer was assigned to check the mailbox to confirm whether new mail had been retrieved, and noted that the mailbox was indeed empty, while the trash bin had been pulled to the curb earlier in the afternoon. But these facts held no value in confirming Ethan was actually inside the house at the exact time Grace disappeared. Additionally, during the preliminary interview, Ethan appeared quite tense when asked whether he had seen any strangers or the dark-colored van described by Lydia. He said he did not recall seeing anyone, but a slight change in his voice led one officer to note in the records that the subject showed signs of unease when answering questions related to the street area. This was not considered incriminating evidence, but it was sufficient to place Ethan in the group requiring deeper scrutiny. When the two officers inspected his backyard and garage, they found no unusual traces, no soil skid marks or small footprints. His old pickup truck, a 1969 Ford model, was parked in the garage with a slightly dusty hood, indicating it had not been used in the recent hours. In response to questions about the time frame from 6 o'clock to 6:40, Ethan only repeated that he was home but could not recall specific activities because nothing special happened. The officers clearly noted this as a weak alibi, unverifiable against actual timelines, and lacking witness confirmation. However, what made Ethan a person requiring closer monitoring was that Lydia had seen him standing by the fence that same morning, while Grace was jumping back and forth on the stepping stones in the front yard. Although this detail fell outside the disappearance window, it indicated that Lydia had a certain impression of Ethan's presence and remembered that he had exchanged a few greeting words with Grace. This was not criminal behavior, but combined with his home's location and short access distance, it made Ethan a subject for analyzing the possibility of approaching the front yard if intent existed. The search results inside Ethan's home were also recorded: no clothes with fresh soil, no signs he left the house for a few short minutes before the screaming, but the absence of departure signs was not strong enough evidence since the time was too brief to necessarily leave traces. Additionally, when asked if he had seen any Plymouth Voyager parked near the Howard house, Ethan replied that he had not noticed because he was usually inside at that time. The officer noted this as a neutral response, but lacking useful information. Reese, upon reviewing all collected data, assessed that Ethan had 3 factors warranting placement on the person of interest list. First, home location within direct access range. Second, weak alibi without supporting witnesses. Third, presence near Grace that morning. However, there were also 2 factors reducing suspicion: no physical traces found in the home or yard, matching a child abduction scenario, and no reports of noise or unusual activity from Ethan's house at the critical time. Reese classified Ethan not as a formal suspect, but as a subject for continued investigation in the persons of interest group, meaning not viewed as the perpetrator, but not excludable from analysis. This helped the investigation team maintain balance between not overlooking important possibilities and not hastily assigning blame without clear evidence. After completing the evaluation, Reese requested updating the file and adding Ethan's name to the POI list, along with all related data on location, timing, reactions, and behavior on the evening Grace disappeared, ensuring that any information related to him would be cross-checked against other timelines and events as new data emerged. After Ethan Markley was added to the person of interest list, and the officers completed the internal evaluation of his alibi and location, Lieutenant Reese directed the investigation team to shift focus to a thorough search of the entire Howard family property to determine if any physical evidence inside the house or backyard could assist in accurately reconstructing Grace's final minutes or identifying potential directions she might have approached before disappearing. The search began in Grace's bedroom on the first floor. as it contained all her personal belongings and might show signs of her leaving the room or taking items before going to the yard that afternoon. 2 officers were assigned to check the room by sections: bed, play table, closet, and window area. They noted that Grace's room was tidy, with no signs of disturbance that day, toys still in place, and the bedroom window closed, ruling out any exit through that area. On the floor, one officer found a small slipper out of its usual position, but Elaine confirmed Grace had worn the slippers to the yard herself and tried to remove them while playing, so this detail held no unusual value. No items in the room raised suspicion or indicated Grace took anything special before going outside. With the bedroom confirmed to have no relevant signs, the investigation team moved to the backyard, which received less attention during the initial afternoon response. The backyard extended about 20 feet from the back door to the rear fence, with several low bushes scattered along the fence line. Since the backyard was not where Grace was playing at the time of disappearance, the officers focused on determining if any overlooked signs of entry or approach from that direction existed. One officer noted minor scratches on the left fence rail, but Robert explained he planned to repair them over the weekend and they predated the incident. Checking the ground around this area revealed hard soil with little disturbance, no small footprints or drag marks, reinforcing the assessment that Grace did not pass through the backyard on the day of the incident. Moving to the right fence, bordering a narrow path leading to the forest edge and marked as a possible exit, the officers noted a particular point, an 8-inch-long patch of soil displaced from the flat surface, appearing as if something had slid across it. Since the scene had been disturbed by initial spontaneous searches, the team could not determine if the slide mark originated from a child, adult, or object. However, as this was the only relatively intact trace on the right fence, the responsible officer marked it on paper and requested photographs for the record. Beyond this slide mark, there were no small footprints, no discarded items, and no fabric fibers caught on the adjacent fence edge. As the 2 officers moved along the fence to continue checking, they discovered a very small red fabric thread caught on a rough wood splinter at the bottom, near the garden corner. The thread was only about 1 centimeter long and very hard to see unless standing right at the fence edge, but since the color matched the plastic hoop Grace was playing with, one officer immediately requested collection to prevent wind or loss. The thread was picked with tweezers, placed in a clean nylon bag, and labeled unidentified fiber, backyard fence area, right side. However, when cross-referencing with the possibility of Grace contacting the right fence during the disappearance window, no data from Lydia's statement or the timeline indicated Grace ever stood near that position, so the evidentiary value of the thread remained undetermined. It was stored in the unclassified evidence group. The investigation team continued checking the area behind the garden, where the fence met the forest edge. Since this area was unused by the family that day and outside Grace's play zone, the group primarily scanned to rule out external approach signs. The ground surface here showed no new marks, no footprints over the fence, no unusually broken branches. The area was deemed low relevance to Grace's disappearance, but officers still took panoramic photos to ensure no data was missed. Upon completing the full backyard and fence check, the investigation team compiled the minor evidence items recorded: the slide mark on the right fence, the unidentified red thread, and the slipper position in Grace's room. The slide mark and thread were placed in evidence bags per proper temporary storage protocol, with individual codes and clear collection times for future cross-referencing. Reese directed the team to store the evidence in the command vehicle locker to prevent loss during expanded searches. Although the backyard evidence did not provide definitive answers about Grace's disappearance, the thorough collection and storage ensured any detail potentially important in later analysis phases was preserved to standard, supporting event reconstruction as new data was added. Immediately after completing the full search of the Howard family property and securing the minor undetermined value evidence items, Lieutenant Reese launched the second search phase with K-9 unit support to recheck the entire area adjacent to the front yard, using scent tracking from Grace's clothing and personal items. A working dog was brought from the South Bend Patrol Unit, allowed to scent Grace's clothes from the previous day, and immediately led to the plastic hoop location in the front yard. The dog circled the area while sniffing, then moved toward the right fence where the small slide mark had been noted earlier. However, it only paused there for a few seconds, turned its head multiple times toward the main road edge, then quickly headed in that direction. When led to the road edge, it continued sniffing down Alder Lane for over 20 feet, but abruptly stopped at the intersection with Birchwood Court, where the scene had been heavily trafficked by residents during the initial spontaneous search before police arrival. With the entire road and sidewalk disturbed, Grace's scent was mixed with dozens of others, preventing the K9 from determining the next direction. After attempting a left sidewalk shift, the dog only took a few steps before returning to the initial stop point, indicating the scent trail broke within a short range, consistent with the hypothesis that Grace may have been lifted off the ground near the road. To test the possibility of Grace moving to the backyard and forest edge herself, the K9 unit was led around through the back door to scent the entire rear property. However, in under a minute, the dog left the fence area, turned back, and gave no signals indicating a child's scent moving that way. This aligned with initial search phase data, reinforcing the conclusion that Grace did not go through the backyard or toward the forest path. While the K9 unit continued quick sweeps of nearby areas, a group of officers initiated aerial support by calling in the state police helicopter on duty in the Redmond area. The helicopter was dispatched to Bend around 9 p.m. and conducted sweeps with high-powered spotlights along all major roads exiting the neighborhood, including potential parking spots, open lots, and sparse forest near Pilot Butte. The crew focused on common stop points in child missing or roadside cases, but detected no reflections from children's items, no fresh grass swipes, and no unusual parked vehicles during the sweeps. To increase accuracy, the pilot lowered altitude and swept a wider circle covering east and southeast Bend areas, with many small roads exiting Alder Lane. However, each area provided no signs linking to Grace's disappearance. The helicopter noted scattered moving vehicles, but none matching the preliminary Plymouth Voyager description. After completing 2 large sweep circles, the helicopter was directed lower to check temporary parking lots near sparse forest, but results still showed no objects or movement fitting the disappearance time frame. All crew data was radioed to the ground team, confirming no additional leads visible from the air. Meanwhile, the K9 team conducted a second sweep around the main road, but again lost the trail near the original point, reinforcing that Grace's scent did not extend beyond a few dozen feet from the home, consistent with a scenario of her being placed in a vehicle in very little time. When both units, K9 and helicopter, concluded sweeps, a joint report was prepared and sent to Reese. No new traces, no additional evidence, no extended scent trail, and no unusual images or movement recorded from the air. With these results, Reese marked the entire second search phase complete, but without clear progress over the first phase. The short-distance trail loss was noted as a significant factor, indicating Grace most likely did not leave on her own, but was removed from her last position by vehicle or another's action quickly enough to leave no continuous scent trail. However, with no new evidence and no signs at remaining exits, the Phase 2 interim report affirmed only that no additional data existed to expand or narrow the scope technically, and determining Grace's subsequent events would rely on information sources beyond the field. Immediately after the second search phase concluded, without yielding additional clues, Lieutenant Reese conducted a quick briefing with the investigation team to shift to analyzing the possibility of an abduction based on the collected data and the behavioral assessment model used in cases of unexplained child disappearances. First, Reese requested a full comparison of the events with the non-family child abduction category, that is, cases where children are taken by strangers or individuals with no family relation, which is a rare type but often characterized by a short time frame, sudden opportunity, and rapid action. The fact that Grace's scent trail vanished over a very short distance, combined with the unsupervised window of only 3 to 6 seconds, matched the pattern of cases where the perpetrator approaches quickly, picks up the child, and leaves the scene before anyone can notice. Reese assessed that if Grace had wandered off on foot, there would have been a longer scent trail or a chain of footprints consistent with the size of a 5-year-old child. However, both the first and second search phases recorded no such signs. This led to the exclusion of the wander-off model, where a child gets lost on their own, from the list of possibilities. When comparing with behavioral data from non-family abduction cases, the investigation team noted 3 commonly appearing characteristics: the presence of a vehicle near the child's play area, the appearance of a stranger prior to the disappearance, and silent behavior during the approach phase. All 3 factors were present in Grace's case: the dark-colored van that Lydia had noticed earlier, a strange man seen by Mr. Palmer at the street corner, and the disappearance occurring in complete silence. Next, Reese directed the team to evaluate the possibility of family involvement in the incident. According to statements from Elaine and Robert, there were no family conflicts, Grace had no history of neglect or threats from anyone in the family, and no relatives had visited the home that day. Examination of the bedroom and family property showed no signs of disturbance or internal conflict, and the family had proactively called 911 immediately upon discovering Grace was missing, which ruled out any intent to conceal or delay reporting. In Reese's assessment, the family behavioral factors were entirely inconsistent with the structure of abductions by relatives or close acquaintances. Additionally, statements from neighbors and witnesses confirmed that the Howard family exhibited no unusual or controversial behavior on the day of the incident, further reinforcing the exclusion of family involvement. Once the family assessment was ruled out, the investigation team moved to analyzing the potential offender's behavior. Based on the on-site context, the perpetrator was likely someone familiar with the Alder Lane route, or who had passed through the area long enough to observe children playing without drawing attention. The appearance of the man in denim clothing right when Grace was still playing in the yard, and the presence of a woman next to the dark van a few minutes later, indicated that at least one unfamiliar individual was in the area at the critical time. Although the timelines between the 2 witnesses did not align perfectly, this actually clarified the likelihood of an outsider rather than any internal individual. According to behavioral analysis, if it was an opportunistic crime, the perpetrator typically observes the environment, selects a moment when the supervisor is distracted, approaches quickly from a hard-to-see direction, and departs via the nearest route. In Grace's case, the right side of the fence, where there was a slight skid mark and where the canine stopped before losing the scent, lay directly on a route that allowed approach and exit to the main road in seconds. Time calculations also supported this hypothesis. From the moment Lydia turned her back until discovering Grace was gone was only a few seconds, a window too short for any adult in the house or a neighbor to approach, exert influence, and leave the scene without making noise or being seen. This gradually shifted the focus of the analysis toward the hypothesis of an external offender, possibly a passerby, a targeted individual, or someone who had been stalking Grace previously. Reese noted in the report that none of the search and examination results indicated Grace left the yard on her own or was taken by someone in the family. On the contrary, all the field data, including the short scent trail, absolute silence, lack of footprints, the presence of a suspicious vehicle, and witness statements about strangers, aligned with a case of being quickly removed from the location by a non-family individual. Based on this synthesis, Reese temporarily identified the most fitting model to guide subsequent investigation steps as the external offender rapid approach model, placing emphasis on analyzing individuals and vehicles that appeared near the area during the exact time frame when Grace disappeared, as well as tracing any signs related to strangers who passed through Alder Lane that afternoon. Immediately after completing the abduction possibility analysis and determining that the investigation focus belonged to an external offender, Lieutenant Reese moved to the next step, analyzing 3 feasible escape routes based on the terrain structure of Alder Lane, Lydia's supervision lapse time, and a vehicle's potential movement in the first 6 to 10 minutes after Grace's disappearance. This required integrating data from the neighborhood map, the timing of stranger and dark van sightings, and traffic factors that evening. Reese spread out the area map on the hood of the command vehicle, marking Grace's last known position, the location of the plastic hoop, the point where the K9 lost the scent, and the connecting routes from Alder Lane to the major road network. The first escape route, considered the priority, was the direct path from Alder Lane to Birchwood Court, then a left turn onto Highway 7, a road leading straight to the eastern residential area, and taking about 1.5 minutes for a vehicle moving at a slow speed. At a slightly higher speed, one that wouldn't draw attention in a residential area, the vehicle could exit the entire neighborhood in under a minute. This route matched Lydia's statement about the van's position and was also the direction where the K9 lost the scent, suggesting Grace may have been taken to the main road in this direction. The second escape route was in the opposite direction, looping from Alder Lane along Maple Ridge Court, a narrower road with less traffic in the evening and many obscured spots due to tree lines blocking views. This route was longer, taking about 3 minutes to reach the exit near Highway 12, but its advantage was discrete terrain, less noticeable to residents, and suitable for a perpetrator wanting to avoid neighbors' eyes or patrol vehicles. Although no witnesses reported seeing a stranger or vehicle in this area, Reese kept this route on the feasible list because the road characteristics and lighting conditions at the time allowed a vehicle to leave the area without drawing attention. The third escape route led to the southern forest edge, via a small dirt path from the end of Alder Lane down to shallow terrain, then opening to a trail formerly used by locals as a shortcut to Highway 5. This was the longest route, but also the hardest to detect if the perpetrator wanted to avoid main roads. However, since the first search phase found no signs of foot movement in the sparse forest area and the K9 detected no scent trail, Reese marked this route as feasible but low priority, to be used only if the first two yielded no results. After identifying the 3 main routes, Reese directed the team to calculate travel times for each route at both low speeds and accelerating speeds once out of the residential area. For the first route, a vehicle could leave Alder Lane in 40-60 seconds and reach the major road in under 2 minutes, meaning the perpetrator could have moved beyond direct neighbor observation before the family fully realized Grace was missing. The second route took about 3 minutes to exit the residential area, but had the advantage of low traffic, thus low chance of being seen. The third route took at least 4 to 5 minutes to reach the major road, depending on terrain and vehicle speed, making it advantageous only if the perpetrator wanted to avoid all paved roads. When cross-referencing these timelines with the arrival time of the first patrol units on scene, Reese concluded that if Grace was taken between 6:38 and 6:44, the perpetrator had more than 30 minutes to leave the Bend area in any direction before a helicopter was deployed. This necessitated screening all locations where a vehicle could stop, change direction, or temporarily hide within a 1-mile radius from Alder Lane. Reese assigned a group of officers to scan the map in layered order. Layer 1 included all impromptu roadside parking spots along Highways 7 and 12, where drivers often pull over briefly. Layer 2 included vacant lots next to unfinished housing areas. Layer 3 included small intersections between residential and major roads. Layer 4 was dirt roads leading into the sparse forest. One officer noted on the map at least 8 locations where a vehicle could park temporarily without notice: 3 on Highway 7, 2 on Highway 12, 1 along Maple Ridge Court, and 2 near the Southern Trail. Reese noted that in non-family abduction cases, perpetrators often stop the vehicle to check the victim, regain composure, or change direction based on circumstances, so every potential short-stop location had to be included in the screening list. To check the possibility of the perpetrator changing direction after leaving Alder Lane, the behavioral analysis group was asked to evaluate which road aligned most realistically. If the perpetrator intended to leave Bend quickly, the direction toward Highway 7 was the easiest choice due to direct connections to 2 major city exits. If the perpetrator wanted to avoid leaving traces, the Maple Ridge Court route was more suitable due to dim lighting and low housing density. If the perpetrator had planned in advance and wanted more complex terrain, the Forest Edge route could have been chosen despite taking longer. However, There was no physical evidence on any of the 3 routes strong enough to confirm which was used in reality. Reese marked the 3 routes with different priority levels and directed officers to complete the list of locations where a vehicle could stop, change direction, or temporarily conceal itself, to establish a basis for layered searches after analyzing additional data. Thus, the investigation directions were not based on speculation, but built on analyzing routes, timing, and the perpetrator's concealment capabilities during the extremely narrow time window of the incident. Immediately after completing the analysis of the 3 feasible escape routes, Lieutenant Reese shifted focus to the vehicle described by witnesses, a dark-colored van, possibly an older Plymouth Voyager model. Since both Lydia's and Mrs. Jensen's statements mentioned a dark-colored vehicle parked offset on the curb near the Howard home, even if not confirmed as the same one, Reese decided to launch the suspicious vehicle investigation by screening all vans within a 2-mile radius of Alder Lane, starting with the vehicle registration list in Deschutes County. The investigation team separated vans in brown, dark gray, or dark green, colors easily mistaken in low light, and filtered out 13 vehicles registered in the area. However, without a specific license plate, the team had to cross-reference based on body description, door style, and models common in the mid-1970s. To expand the scope, Reese requested contact with the Oregon DMV to retrieve the list of owners with Plymouth Voyagers or similar styled vans within a 5-mile radius of Bend. The results provided an additional 27 dark-colored vehicles, bringing the total to 40 for verification. Officers divided into groups to visit each address on the list to confirm the vehicle's location at the time of Grace's disappearance. The initial focus was on vehicles owned by residents in the immediate neighborhood, due to higher likelihood of presence on Alder Lane. 5 vehicles were quickly verified, 3 were parked at home that evening, 1 was under repair at a shop and couldn't have left, and 1 belonged to a family with young children, confirmed by neighbors as parked in front all afternoon. These vehicles were removed from the suspect list. The remaining vehicles were categorized by ease of access to Alder Lane, based on owner-residence location. For addresses on parallel routes or intersecting Birchwood Court, officers cross-checked owners' work hours, evening routines, and evidence of the vehicle being outside the neighborhood at the critical time. One owner, Mark Dillard, stated his van was parked on the side of Highway 7 around 6:20 while he jogged around Pilot Butte, but he insisted he did not enter Alder Lane and saw no children. Police inspected the vehicle and found only personal items, with no signs a child had been inside. With no contradictory evidence, Dillard's vehicle was cleared. For vehicles outside the neighborhood, the investigation team checked plates against near-match reports from a neighbor 2 blocks away. This person said they saw a van passing through the area around 6:40, but only remembered the last 2 characters as possibly 6B or 8E. Reese immediately requested screening all vans with matching plate endings in the county registration. The results yielded 6 vehicles fitting both possibilities. The first vehicle, checked at an address belonging to a 3-person family, had the owner confirm they left Bend at 5 p.m. for relatives in Redmond and returned after 9 p.m. Toll records matched their provided schedule, so the vehicle was cleared. The second belonged to a middle-aged man living alone near Pine Ridge, but upon inspection, officers found the van parked in the garage with thick dust. The owner said it hadn't been driven for weeks. The third belonged to a woman working at a supermarket with a shift from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. confirmed by her manager. The next 2 belonged to an elderly couple and a family with 5 young children, all with clear alibis. The final vehicle on the list belonged to a man named Lionel Cooper. Officers noted no one answered the door and the van was not in the garage. However, neighbors said they saw Cooper leave with travel bags at noon that day, saying he was heading to Eugene for a few days. Unable to inspect the vehicle directly, it was placed on a temporary watch list, but lacked sufficient grounds for conclusion. Concurrently with checking the registration list, officers also screened vehicles at potential stop points along the 3 escape routes. The 3 temporary parking spots on Highway 7 were checked first, but no evidence showed a van had stopped there during the relevant time. The 2 spots on Highway 12 also showed no unusual tire marks or disturbed soil. At Maple Ridge Court, a vacant lot allowing short-term parking had tire tracks, but was confirmed as belonging to local residents by a nearby homeowner. For the Southern Trail, most dirt surfaces had prior bike and foot traffic marks, making it impossible to pinpoint timing of any specific tracks. When synthesizing the screening results, Reese concluded that most vehicles within a 1-mile radius had been verified and cleared or had clear alibis. The only uninspected vehicle was Cooper's, but there was no evidence it had appeared on Alder Lane. Therefore, in this phase's report, Reese noted that no vehicle on the county registration list had a direct link to the witness's description, and none matched field signs at potential stop points. This did not completely rule out the dark van hypothesis, but significantly narrowed the scope of local owners and eliminated most possibilities that the perpetrator was someone living near Alder Lane. Immediately after completing the canvass of suspicious vehicles without identifying any van matching the witness descriptions, Lieutenant Reese returned to more deeply evaluate the only individual in the area still remaining on the persons of interest list, Ethan Markley. Although there was no direct evidence linking Ethan to Grace's disappearance, his proximity to the scene, weak alibi, and tense reaction during the initial interview led Reese to decide to initiate a second phase of interrogation, focusing on cross-referencing a detailed timeline, inspecting Ethan's personal vehicle, and conducting a polygraph examination in accordance with BPD procedures at the time. The interview was conducted at Ethan's home, but this time with the additional presence of an investigator experienced in behavioral analysis. First, they asked Ethan to recount his entire afternoon from the moment he left work until he heard the screaming from the Howard house. Ethan stated that he left the auto repair shop around 4 o'clock, drove straight home, brought items into the garage, and then stayed in the living room checking some electronic components. When asked about the specific time he went outside to get the mail, Ethan said around 5:45 or 6 o'clock, but when pressed to be more precise, he adjusted it to maybe a little earlier. This change led the investigators to flag Ethan's timeline as fluctuating, especially when compared to the case's integrated timeline, which placed the sighting of the stranger and the van parked in front of the neighborhood between approximately 6:30 and 6:40. Since Ethan could not provide a fixed time, Reese requested to cross-reference his statement with what neighbors had provided. One neighbor across from Ethan's house stated they did not see him go outside between 5:50 and 6:30, but could not confirm it definitively because they were indoors for most of that time. This kept Ethan's alibi at an unverifiable level. Afterward, the investigation shifted to inspecting Ethan's personal vehicle, a 1969 Ford pickup. Although the truck appeared to be rarely used, the team still had to thoroughly check it to rule out the possibility it was involved in the incident. They asked Ethan to open the garage and inspected the entire interior, floor mats, back seat, truck bed, and even under the flooring. The results showed no unusual signs, no strange fibers, no fresh dirt patches on the mats, no children's items, no indications of seat adjustments out of the ordinary. The truck bed had a few scattered dust spots, but no scratches or marks, suggesting a heavy object had been placed in it around the time of the incident. Officers also examined the tires, photographed the tread patterns, and compared them to the soft soil impressions around the yard, but found no matches. When Reese asked Ethan once more if he had seen any dark-colored van that afternoon, Ethan replied that he didn't remember because he was inside the house most of the time. His voice was calmer than during the first interview, but the investigator noted that Ethan often avoided eye contact when asked about the street area where witnesses had seen the van. Although this was not enough to draw conclusions, it was included in the report as a reaction worth considering. The interview then moved to the polygraph step at the investigator's suggestion to increase the clarity of the information. Ethan agreed to participate and was taken to the testing room at BPD headquarters. A polygraph technician attached electrodes to measure heart rate, breathing, and skin conductance. The key questions included, Did you leave your house between 6 o'clock and 6:45? Did you have any contact with Grace Howard that day after the morning? Do you know the man or woman witnesses saw near Alder Lane? Did you set foot in the front yard area of the Howard house around the time Grace disappeared? The polygraph results were evaluated as inconclusive, meaning there was no clear evidence Ethan was lying, but also not stable enough to confirm he was completely truthful. His physiological responses to some questions showed unusually high anxiety, especially when mentioning the 6:30 to 6:40 timeframe, but the technician noted that a stressed or nervous individual could produce similar reactions, so the results could not be used as incriminating evidence. In the summary report, investigators concluded that Ethan provided no clearly contradictory information. His timeline was uncertain, but showed no signs of breaking the time constraints to reach the Howard yard in the brief seconds without being seen. The vehicle inspection yielded no relevant signs, and the polygraph results were not strong enough to elevate Ethan to formal suspect status. Reese noted clearly that although Ethan remained on the persons of interest list, the second phase interview provided no new data or clear directing factors to increase the level of suspicion. Therefore, at that time, Ethan was retained as a subject to monitor, but without sufficient basis to conclude he was directly involved in Grace's disappearance, and his file would continue to be updated as new data emerged. Immediately after completing the second phase interview with Ethan, without obtaining any breakthrough information, Lieutenant Reese requested a comprehensive compilation of all investigative data since Grace's disappearance to determine if any leads could still be pursued. However, when the forensics team re-examined the evidence collected from the front yard, backyard, right side fence, and adjacent areas, they found that no samples had clear forensic value. The red fiber recovered from the right side fence did not match any specific clothing item of Grace's beyond having a similar color to the plastic bracelet, a detail too broad to serve as evidence. The skid marks on the soil could not be sourced because the area had been heavily disturbed. Nothing was missing from Grace's room. Ethan's garage and vehicle contained no unusual traces, and the sparse wooded area was completely devoid of data. When the team reviewed the K9 and helicopter reports, the conclusions remained unchanged. The scent trail stopped near the main road without extending in any other direction. Aerial observation recorded no suspicious vehicles or movements in the potentially relevant time frame. All these factors made expanding the search radius meaningless without a clear anchor point. In addition to the deadlock on physical evidence, no additional witnesses emerged after the first evening. In the following days, police went door to door within a half-mile radius of Alder Lane, asking each resident if they had seen strangers, unusual vehicles, or suspicious activity. Most residents were indoors that evening and observed nothing further. Some mentioned hearing dogs barking, but were unsure of the timing, while others noted seeing a few cars on Route 7, but could not recall details. The statements from Mr. Palmer and Miss Jensen remained the only two pieces of information, but conflicted on timing and suspect descriptions. The fact that two independent witnesses saw two different strangers, one man, one woman, split the investigative direction and prevented focus on any specific individual. No one saw Grace being taken, and there were no direct witnesses confirming an abduction. Efforts to locate the strangers based on descriptions of a denim jacket or light-colored coat were unsuccessful. The van description was also not distinctive enough to identify due to its dark color, common model, and poor lighting, making it hard for witnesses to distinguish accurately. After 3 weeks of intensive investigation, 5 weeks of expanded canvassing, and multiple rounds of additional analysis, the investigation yielded no new leads. There were no effective investigative avenues to pursue, no data to reconstruct an escape route, no specific suspects, and no physical evidence confirming a criminal act. All analysis circled back to the starting point. Grace vanished in a matter of seconds, leaving no trace, unseen by anyone, without noise, without a prolonged scent trail, without supporting events. Even the two witnesses who saw strangers only provided fragmented information that could not establish a direct connection to Grace or the exact moment of disappearance. In the second month, the Bend police continued to classify the case as missing juvenile, suspected abduction, but lacked sufficient basis to upgrade it to confirmed abduction. As 1978 began, the case remained on the open investigation list, but with no new updates. The Howard family repeatedly contacted authorities requesting expanded searches to neighboring counties, but there was no evidence proving Grace was still in the Bend area or had left via any route. All options were speculative and could not be planned based on facts. By the end of 1979, after more than 2 years of searching and investigating, with dozens of reports filed but yielding no results, the Bend Police Department began considering shifting the case to inactive status. There were no tip calls, no voluntary witnesses, no additional evidence, no matches with missing children records in nearby areas. In total, over 300 hours of scene investigation, over 70 locations checked, nearly 50 vehicles verified, but no data strong enough to open new directions. In early 1980, after completing a comprehensive state-mandated review for long-term missing persons cases, Grace Howard's file was officially reclassified as a cold case. This meant the investigation would no longer be actively pursued and would only be revisited upon new leads or emerging technology. The file was sealed, archived along with the small evidence items collected in 1977, and the emptiness surrounding Grace's fate became one of Bend's most haunting mysteries at the time. In the initial months after Grace Howard's file was reclassified as a cold case in 1980, the Howard family refused to accept the suspension of the investigation. Elaine and Robert continued visiting the Bend Police Department, typically every 2 or 3 months, requesting updates and urging the case be reopened. Each visit brought the same questions: any new calls, any children found elsewhere matching Grace's description, any reports of suspicious vehicles or individuals in the Bend area in recent years. But BPD's answers were always the same: no new data, no matching reports, nothing sufficient to reactivate the investigation. The officers originally involved gradually transferred to other units or retired, and each time Elaine returned, she met new detectives who knew the case only from files and had no memory of the initial hours after Grace went missing. This increasingly worried the family that the incident might fade into oblivion if they did not continually remind authorities. Between 1980 and 1983, BPD performed periodic updates per procedure. Once a year, Grace's file was pulled to cross-check against missing children cases in the Northwest United States for possible matches. Several cases were compared by height, birth year, and identifying features, but all were ruled out. The evidence retained from 1977 was also re-examined, but forensic technology at the time was insufficient to extract DNA from small fibers or any traces from the right side fence. All physical data was deemed no further analyzable. A few years later, around 1984, Ethan Markley, the only initial person of interest, suddenly filed notice of moving to Washington State. A POI, leaving the jurisdiction, is typically noted in the file for tracking, but since Ethan's suspicion level had never been elevated and there was no evidence against him, BPD had no legal grounds to detain him or request surveillance. The file noted Ethan's move along with his new address, but since no leads connected him in the prior 7 years, the event was recorded only as peripheral information. When Elaine learned of Ethan's departure, she again visited BPD, asking if this opened any new investigative avenues, but the response remained the same as previous years: no connection between Ethan and any other case data, so his leaving Bend held no significance for the file. From the mid to late 1980s, efforts to locate Grace were largely carried out by the family themselves. They posted flyers, contacted newly established missing children organizations, sent letters to police in neighboring states, and occasionally received calls with tips, but all led to dead ends. Some reported seeing a blonde girl in a Salem supermarket. Others claimed encountering a child resembling Grace in an Idaho park, but upon comparing photos and descriptions, none matched. In rare instances, BPD assisted in verifying these tips, but always concluded they held no investigative value. Around 1986, per Oregon regulations, certain cold cases were reviewed when new technology emerged or during special state-mandated evaluations. Grace's file was included, but immediately excluded, because there was no DNA or biological trace sufficient for analysis. Remaining physical evidence consisted only of the red fiber, photographed soil skid marks that could not be collected, and the location of the plastic bracelet, all unusable for new techniques. This kept the case sealed in the cold case files, awaiting a strong enough lead to pull it back. For the family, each passing year was a cycle of hope, followed by disappointment. Elaine maintained the habit of writing monthly letters to Bend police, recounting memories of Grace and asking if anything was new. Robert quietly clipped newspaper articles about missing children from various places, pasted them into a notebook, and noted beside them that Grace is still out there somewhere. Some veteran officers from the 1977 shift, when questioned again in the late 1980s, still remembered the case as a classic example of the challenges in investigating child disappearances before DNA technology. They acknowledged that the scene being disturbed from the outset had robbed subsequent efforts of the necessary foundation. But since no one was directly at fault, and there was no evidence to reconstruct the scene, the case existed only in thin documentation. By 1990, more than 13 years after Grace's disappearance, the file still lacked data to act in any direction. No suspects to track, no suspicious vehicles, no additional witnesses emerging in later years, and no discoveries suggesting Grace had ever left Bend or remained in the area. The case gradually fell silent, not because it was completely forgotten, but because there was no way to move forward. In the Bend Police Department's cold case system, Grace Howard's became one of the longest-standing files of a child vanishing without a trace. The Howard family continued regular contact with police, but the response was always the same. No new data, nothing to reopen the investigation. And thus, throughout a decade full of technological and societal changes, Grace's disappearance remained frozen at its starting point, no progress, no resolution, no explanation. When the Grace Howard case file fell into cold case status, and many years passed without anyone knowing what happened after the moment the child disappeared from the front yard, Grace's actual journey that night was only reconstructed later through fragmented memories and subsequently confirmed information. According to the sequence of events pieced together, the person who took Grace did not linger long on Alder Lane, but left the neighborhood in under a minute after carrying her out of the yard. The dark-colored van that witnesses had seen earlier was most likely already parked in a favorable observation position, with the front of the vehicle facing toward Birchwood Court, allowing it to exit the residential area without having to turn around or perform any noticeable maneuvers. The choice of the moment when Lydia turned her back for a few seconds indicates that the perpetrator was familiar with the neighborhood's daily routines, or had at least observed long enough to identify this blind spot in supervision. When Grace was placed in the vehicle, it drove straight out to Birchwood Court and then turned left onto Highway 7. Since it was already twilight at that time, traveling at an average speed under 20 miles per hour would not draw attention and would not be considered unusual. After leaving Highway 7, instead of continuing on major routes toward downtown Bend, the van is believed to have turned onto a smaller road that ran along a thin strip of forest connecting to the eastern side of the city. This route had few homes, dim lighting, and many small unpaved intersections, making it suitable for someone wanting to avoid leaving traces or having their license plate remembered. About 10 to 12 minutes after leaving Alder Lane, the vehicle entered an area with few streetlights, where engine noise would not carry far due to the dense trees on both sides. During this journey, Grace was most likely kept quiet in the back seat or the middle compartment of the van, with no opportunity to make noise or have contact with the outside. Behavioral analyses indicate that the perpetrator's departure from Bend that same night is a clear sign of a pre-planned operation, as the route taken was not one familiar to locals who simply drove around the area. As soon as it reached the eastern edge of Bend, the vehicle is believed to have turned onto one of two smaller roads heading south, connecting to US 97 highway, but in a direction that avoided checkpoints or high traffic areas. At that time, these secondary routes still allowed travel to nearby small towns without passing through busy intersections. Choosing the smaller roads shows that the perpetrator prioritized discretion over speed. About 1 hour after leaving Bend, the vehicle is believed to have stopped on a deserted dirt road section to check on Grace's condition. Later analyses show that Grace was not abandoned but was continued to be taken further, proving that the perpetrator had no intention of leaving her or handing her over to someone else immediately. After the short stop, the vehicle continued through connecting roads between small towns in eastern Oregon, where population was sparse and nighttime traffic was minimal. In the late 1970s, eastern Oregon still had agricultural roads interspersed between towns, ideal for someone wanting to avoid identification. Based on the reconstructed milestones, the vehicle most likely traveled an additional 90 to 100 minutes before stopping a second time. This stop occurred in an area with sparse homes, far from major roads, and with many small dirt driveways leading to properties. This area had no nighttime commercial activity, reducing the chance of the vehicle being noticed. At this location, Grace was transferred from the vehicle into a house or temporary shelter. The transfer happening that same night indicates that the perpetrator had prepared a hideout in advance or had prior connections to the place. Later analyses reveal that the first place Grace was taken was not the final destination, but only a transit point to avoid attention in the initial hours after the disappearance. In the house or shelter, Grace was kept for a short time, possibly just a few hours or one night, depending on what the perpetrator deemed necessary to monitor the response from the Bend community and see if the case triggered an urgent pursuit beyond expectations. Since there was no Amber Alert system or rapid information dissemination technology at the time, the perpetrator knew that the search response would take hours to mobilize forces and days to expand beyond Bend. Exploiting this gap in the response chain, the perpetrator moved Grace to another location early the next morning. The second route taken was reconstructed based on feasible terrain and characteristics that Grace later remembered. The vehicle left the temporary hideout while it was still dark, traveling on low-traffic roads, heading south or southeast, where the terrain opened up, and there were many small towns where a stranger could blend in without drawing notice. The immediate change of location shows that the perpetrator understood the initial hideout was only needed for the first few hours and was not safe for longer stays. The continued journey lasted many hours until the vehicle reached an area far enough from Bend to minimize the risk of pursuit. This was where Grace was brought into a new living environment, not a place initially familiar to the perpetrator in Bend, but one calculated in advance to create sufficient geographic distance to sever all ties to the area of the incident. In this phase, the clearest reconstructed fact is that Grace was completely removed from Bend that very first night and continued moving the next morning. The continuous location changes in the first 24 hours indicate this was not the impulsive act of a random stranger who happened to appear on Alder Lane, but a small-scale yet effectively organized plan to sever traces and evade initial pursuit. The entire journey that night and the following morning occurred in silence, on low-traffic routes, with short stops in one temporary shelter before moving to the pre-prepared primary residence. This sequence of movements made the case one of the most difficult to reconstruct in Bend's investigative history, as every step was taken while police were still gathering initial information and had not yet expanded the search beyond city limits. Grace left Bend without leaving traces, with no witnesses seeing the vehicle on any road segments after exiting the neighborhood, and no specific identifying details sufficient to reconstruct the route at the time. Only many years later, when rare memory fragments were pieced together, did Grace's abduction journey that night and the following day become a clearer part of the overall picture of the decades-long disappearance. After Grace was taken out of Bend and moved through a series of remote roads that night, and the next morning, the little girl's life entered a phase completely detached from her true identity. The final stopping point in that journey was a small house deep in a sparsely populated area in southeastern Oregon, a place not connected to any major route, with no nearby neighbors and rarely visited by passers-by. There she was renamed almost immediately. The person who took her, who was later determined to have planned it in advance, called her by a new name, Lila Maddox. This name was repeated often enough that Grace was gradually forced to respond to it instead of her real one. In the early days, she still remembered and reacted to Grace, but any time she accidentally said it or asked about her parents, the abductor stopped her coldly and firmly, forcing her to accept that Lila was her new and only name. From here, the re-identification process was deliberate. The clothes she wore were no longer those of Grace Howard, but were replaced with old, plain outfits without patterns or bright colors. Any items that could remind her of Bend or the Howard family were eliminated. When the little girl tried to ask when she could go home, the perpetrator only gave negative responses or changed the subject. Severing memories of her origins was seen as the first step in detaching her from her old life. Grace's new life, now as Lila Maddox, was not stable in a single location. After a short time at the house in southeastern Oregon, the perpetrator began moving her to different places. Location changes happened frequently, sometimes every few months, sometimes only weeks, depending on factors the abductor assessed as risk of detection. Lila was taken along small towns, scattered homes near agricultural roads, and occasionally temporary rentals. The constant relocations meant the child had no chance to form relationships with anyone, no friends, no familiar neighbors, and never stayed long enough for anyone to notice she was a child without documents. Location changes were often done at night, similar to how she left Bend. Sometimes just a strange noise outside, or a slow-passing vehicle, was enough for the perpetrator to decide to leave immediately. Lila was always required to pack her things into small bags, and was never allowed to keep too many belongings. She was not permitted to have any personal toys to avoid them appearing and drawing attention in new places. These practices maintained a state of uncertainty and prevented her from developing attachment to any location. In addition to constant moves, Lila lived under complete control. She was not allowed outside alone, not permitted to talk to strangers, and not allowed to look out windows for too long. Windows in many places were covered with thick curtains, some even nailed shut, with only a small slit left for light. When Lila asked why she couldn't look outside, the perpetrator gave short answers like, "People aren't supposed to see you," or "It's dangerous outside." Such statements, repeated over time, created fear and made her afraid to try escaping. The places Lila lived were usually houses set back from main roads, with side entrances or little-used dirt paths. In some, she was kept in a separate room for many hours each day. In others, she had to learn to sit still and stay quiet when anyone approached. In a few homes, furnishings were minimal, just a bed, an old table, and a few essential items. This made Lila's living spaces monotonous and hard to distinguish, which later caused her memories to fade, unable to pinpoint where she had been, how long, or who she had encountered. When moving to larger towns, control was even tighter. Lila was not allowed out during the day. If going out was necessary, she had to wear a hat or scarf to cover her face. The perpetrator always held her hand tightly, staying very close to prevent separation or attention. When buying food or supplies, Lila was made to stand behind or in a hidden corner. No one knew who she was, and no one had the chance to ask. Any glance toward her caused the perpetrator to change direction or leave immediately. Lila's control extended beyond space to language and information. She was not allowed to ask about Bend, her parents, or her real name. If she did, the perpetrator responded with threats or locked her in the room, leaving her alone for hours until she became quiet again. Over time, Lila learned to hide questions in her mind because any sign of old memories led to punishment or prolonged coldness. Her memories gradually fragmented. Images of the wooden house, the red bracelet, and her parents' faces faded as she had to adapt to the new name and ever-changing life. One consistent factor throughout this entire period was that no one in the communities where Lila was taken knew who she was or where she came from. There was no school, no medical records, no temporary registration. Lila lived off the grid, which helped avoid detection by authorities, but also left her with no reference points to affirm her existence outside the abductor's control. For nearly a decade after being taken from Bend, her new identity, Lila Maddox, was not just a name but a constructed reality designed to replace all old memories. The constant relocations, lack of friends, lack of community, and perpetual vigilance meant she had no opportunity to ask bigger questions about the outside world or why she didn't belong anywhere. She existed in an isolated space, with rules set by her abductor, and those rules became the only behaviors she could rely on. As she grew older, she increasingly realized she had no control over anything, from where she lived, the moves, to even her own thoughts, if they didn't align with the Guardian's demands. This was not just separation from Bend, but separation from her own life, living under an identity not of her choosing, in a limited world built so she could never question the past and never find a way back. As she entered adulthood, Lila Maddox, the name that Grace was forced to use for many years, continued to live in complete isolation from the social system, with no legal traces proving her existence beyond the scope permitted by her guardian. The absence of a birth certificate, a social security number, and any stored medical records made her a person who did not exist in the eyes of any administrative agency. This forced Lila to live according to rules imposed since childhood. Avoid places that might require identification, do not seek formal employment, avoid locations where identity could be checked, do not participate in the community, and do not allow anyone to question her origins. As she grew older, Lila gradually realized that lacking a legal identity controlled nearly every aspect of her life. Throughout her teenage years, she was not allowed to attend school. No classes, no friends, no teachers, no standard textbooks. All she had were a few old books permitted by her guardian, mostly worn children's books or magazines picked up from temporary homes. Because she was not educated through a formal curriculum, her reading and writing abilities developed sporadically, without sequence, largely based on self-observation or random memorization rather than systematic teaching. By the age when she should have been in high school, Lila had no idea how schools operated, how students interacted, or that having teachers instruct daily was normal. Everything related to education was kept out of her reach. Due to not attending school and having no learning opportunities, she had no diplomas, no certificates, and no basic social skills beyond what she learned from observing her guardian or during rare outings for shopping. This made it difficult for her to understand how society outside functioned, from how people worked to how they used documents for travel or transactions. This lack of foundation became part of the restrictive structure she was trapped in, making escape from her situation even more difficult. In addition to lacking legal identity and formal education, Lila was also isolated from any broader social contact. Throughout her teens and early 20s, she almost never spoke to anyone besides her guardian. When they moved to a new place, she was not allowed to interact with neighbors. When shopping, she was only permitted to stand in the background and avoid eye contact. If someone greeted her or tried to start a conversation, she was immediately pulled away. The only time she had brief interactions with strangers were when they glanced at her in a store or when she passed someone on the street. But all were short and under strict supervision. This caused her to lack communication skills, confidence, and she easily became anxious when asked any questions about herself. This prolonged social isolation not only separated her from those around her, but also meant she did not know what normal relationships were like. She had no friends, no peers to share with, no understanding of the concept of friend groups or community. When she saw other young people talking on the street, she could only observe from afar, unable to imagine what it felt like or how to join in. The early years of adulthood made this situation even harder to change. When they moved to a larger town, opportunities for contact with the outside world seemed to increase. but her guardian controlled everything more tightly to prevent Lila from accidentally drawing attention or being questioned about identification. She was not allowed to work, open a bank account, or buy things with a card, rent a place, or talk to outsiders without permission. The very lack of identifying records made it impossible for her to independently establish any activity in modern society. An adult without documents could hardly find legal work, rent housing, see a doctor, or even register a phone. Any sign of the world beyond her guardian's control made her anxious that if asked for papers, she could be taken somewhere else without understanding what was happening. The isolation was not only administrative and social, but also became part of the identity that Lila was forced to accept. Having been taught since childhood that outside there are people looking, that the streets are dangerous, she lived in a vague but constant state of fear. This fear prevented her from actively seeking help from anyone, from approaching any agency, and she lacked the knowledge to even know which agency could assist her. Without support, identity, or anyone to trust, even thinking about seeking help was beyond her reach. Nevertheless, over time, Lila still grew into a physical adult, but with a limited social foundation and truncated knowledge. In the eyes of the few people who had encountered her, Lila appeared timid, quiet, avoiding eye contact, and always wary. No one knew that behind that silence was a life without documents, without schooling, without friends, and without the ability to step into the world the way normal adults could. She existed as a shadow outside the scope of society, an adult without identity, living in the gaps between addresses, unconnected to any records, with no clear path to escape the control that had formed since childhood. The change in Lila's life began with an unforeseen incident, a minor but serious enough accident that forced her to directly interact with the healthcare system, something her guardian had always avoided at all costs. On an autumn afternoon, while helping carry some heavy items into a temporary rental house on the outskirts of Eugene, Lila carelessly slipped on rain-slick wooden steps. The fall sent her crashing onto the concrete, with strong impact to her shoulder and the right side of her head. Her guardian tried to handle it at home as usual, but when Lila began feeling dizzy, short of breath, and nearly passed out for a few minutes, they were forced to take her to the emergency room, something they had evaded for years. At the local hospital, the intake staff required the two minimum things: a legal name and identification. The guardian provided the name Lila Maddox, but could not produce any documents. No birth certificate, no ID card, no social security number, not even health insurance. The medical staff noted, no ID, possible unregistered adult, but since Lila's head condition needed immediate evaluation, they admitted her to the emergency assessment area. There, she underwent shoulder x-rays and a head CT scan. Fortunately, there was no intracranial bleeding, but she had a mild concussion and a dislocated shoulder, requiring immobilization and overnight monitoring. During that time, administrative staff continued questioning the guardian about Lila's personal information to complete the hospital records. With no documents, the guardian gave evasive answers, offering vague details like, "We just moved here, she doesn't have a card, didn't bring papers." But when asked to verify date of birth or permanent address, the inconsistencies in responses raised suspicions at the hospital. A nurse noted internally that Lila reacted like someone who had never had a formal medical visit, avoiding eye contact, answering hesitantly, and seeming afraid of signing any paperwork. After her treatment stabilized, the hospital contacted social services as required for cases without identification to verify identity. When a social worker came to speak with Lila, she could not provide clear information. She only knew the name Lila Maddox, did not remember her exact birth date, could not provide previous addresses, did not know the name of any school attended, and had no way to describe her past chronologically. When asked about family, she looked toward the guardian, as if waiting for permission to speak, which further alarmed the social worker. In the report sent to Oregon DHS, they clearly stated, adult female, estimated 2022, no identification, inconsistent personal history, accompanied by Guardian, with conflicting responses. This was a red flag under state risk assessment standards, especially amid increasing identification of undocumented adults or those showing signs of control. DHS forwarded the report to Child Protective Services to evaluate whether the accompanying person truly had custody rights over Lila, as authorities could not determine if she was a legal adult based on appearance alone. When CPS arrived at the hospital, they requested to separate Lila from the Guardian for a private interview. The Guardian strongly objected, saying it was unnecessary and we don't want to deal with any agencies, behavior that immediately raised CPS's alert level. Lila was taken to a separate room for the discussion, and during that time, all her responses showed she had no control over her life. No documents, unknown true age, unknown birthplace, no memory of any prior hospital visits, no understanding of health insurance, no basic information typical for an adult. When finally asked, "Who decides where you live and where you go?" she did not answer, only silently looked down at her hands. That was enough for CPS to open an identity verification case under procedures for adults showing signs of unlawful supervision or control. The file was noted as identity unknown, needs verification. The hospital allowed Lila to stay overnight for concussion monitoring, while CPS began gathering basic information to verify whether she truly was Lila Maddox or someone with a completely different identity. Those initial questions, the ones Lila could not answer, marked the beginning of her file, entering a new legal phase, the first time after many years of being kept in the dark, where no one knew who she was or where she came from. When the identity unknown, needs verification case was officially opened by CPS, the next step in the identity verification process was to assess the possibility that Lila Maddox was not actually the person her name suggested. Since she had no birth certificate, no social security number, and could not provide any basic information about her origins, CPS decided to request a DNA test to compare against national databases for missing or unidentified persons. When the social worker informed Lila about the sample collection, she appeared confused and somewhat fearful, but did not resist. This aligned with her lifelong pattern of response, not questioning, not objecting, simply silently accepting whatever others imposed. At the hospital, a technician was assigned to collect a buccal swab, a simple procedure that had the potential to unlock information that decades-long investigations had never accessed. The technician gently swabbed the inside of Lila's left and right cheeks with a sterile cotton swab for a few seconds. The sample was placed in a specialized container, sealed with a temporary patient code, and immediately sent to the state lab. Meanwhile, CPS finalized the case file with notes on Lila's lack of information, including her inability to determine her birth date, no memory of prior residences, and no documents supporting the name Lila Maddox. Once the DNA sample was submitted, the lab began the process of isolating standard genetic markers to create a CODIS-compatible DNA profile, including the 20 STR loci, commonly used for matching in identification systems. The biological analysis was conducted in two phases. The first extracting DNA from oral mucosal cells, the second amplifying and running electrophoresis to read the markers. Although this process was routine for the lab, in Lila's case, it held special significance since no other data source could verify who she was. When the complete DNA profile was generated, the technician entered the data into the state system and then submitted it to CODIS, the national database network containing hundreds of thousands of samples from missing persons cases, unidentified individuals, and victims' relatives. Simultaneously, CPS submitted a matching request to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which maintains records of missing children from multiple decades. Since Lila did not know her actual birth date, the profile was searched by estimated age group, general identifying features, and DNA sample. The system would compare her sample against numerous records collected over the years, including cases previously marked no match due to lack of genetic data. This phase was entirely automated. The DNA data was compared against numerous records in CODIS's missing person and unidentified person systems. If any locus showed high similarity, the system would generate an alert for the lab to perform manual verification for confirmation. Since the sample screening process could take days to weeks depending on the number of related records, CPS and the hospital could only wait for results while continuing to document the limited information from Lila. During that time, the lab continued analyzing sample stability, checking data quality, and comparing each of Lila's markers against open cases from years prior. One key step was for the system to determine if Lila's sample fit into one of the three main categories: missing person, unidentified person, or relative in open cases to confirm kinship. Since Lila provided so little information, the likelihood of her falling into the first two categories was considered higher. When the data was entered into the missing child system, it was compared not only against new records, but also old ones from the 1970s and 1980s that had been digitized and updated into CODIS in later years. The system would analyze each genetic marker, search for matches by probability level, and produce a list of records needing re-examination. In Lila's case, since there was no initial direct comparison sample, her data was run through multiple comparisons with missing children who had family DNA information or samples from relatives stored previously. This biological analysis process was the only factor capable of breaking the years-long silence in her case. Though she did not know it, the small buccal swab collected at the hospital had become the first verifiable source of information that could determine her true identity after decades of being separated from a legal existence. She was unaware that the DNA results would trigger an irreversible chain reaction in national data systems, and for the first time since 1977, the question "Who is Lila Maddox?" could potentially be answered by the genetic markers her body had carried throughout her life, the only data her overseer could not alter, hide, or control. The comparison of Lila Maddox's DNA sample with the CODIS system occurred entirely automatically in the initial hours, but the breakthrough event happened in the early morning of the fourth day after the sample was entered into the system. As the analyzer completed the matching sequence with missing child records from previous decades, a red alert appeared on the Oregon State Lab's coordination interface, displaying an unusually high match level between Lila's DNA sample and a digitized old record from 2004, the case of Grace Howard, the child who went missing in Bend in 1977. The system automatically flagged genetic compatibility at multiple STR loci exceeding the standard match threshold, indicating a near-certain probability that Lila's DNA sample matched the previously collected Howard family profile when relatives submitted samples during a cold case review years after the disappearance. The initial lab technician thought the system had erred when comparing an adult sample to a missing child case over 30 years old. However, upon reviewing the locus data, they saw the match was too clear to be a technical error. After rerunning the comparison twice more, the results remained the same. Lila's DNA matched the Howard family profile with extremely high probability, confirming she was almost certainly Grace Howard, the 5-year-old child who mysteriously vanished more than 3 decades earlier. The lab technician immediately activated the regulated alert procedure for matches with long-term missing child cases. The report was sent simultaneously to the National CODIS Office, NCIB-NEC, and the Oregon State Liaison Agency. Within less than an hour after final confirmation, the system generated an urgent notification to the Bend Police Department, the unit that opened Grace Howard's case in 1977, and shifted it to cold case status in 1980. At BPD, the notification appeared in the cold case coordination inbox with a shocking subject line, "Critical DNA match. Missing child case #7704H, subject potentially located." The cold case investigator at the time, who had not been involved in the original case but was familiar with the file through periodic reviews, immediately opened the alert and cross-checked the data. Upon seeing the name Grace Howard and the words "match confirmed," he paused for a few seconds to ensure he wasn't misreading. He then proceeded with the final internal verification process, connecting directly with the state lab to inquire about reliability. The lab confirmed that Lila's sample matched the Howard family samples with probability exceeding the threshold, and that this could not be a random coincidence. Once the information was verified, BPD immediately notified command. The cold case lieutenant requested an emergency meeting, assembling all investigators connected to the Grace Howard file, including those who had reviewed it during the 1986, 1990, and 2004 sweeps. The old case boxes, containing scene sketches, Lydia's statements, Mr. Palmer's and Mrs. Jensen's testimonies, evidence photos, and all notes from the original investigation, were retrieved from cold case storage, where they had sat undisturbed for over 30 years. As the file boxes were placed on the table, the atmosphere in the meeting room shifted noticeably. Many younger investigators had never witnessed the case when it occurred, but knew it as one of Ben's most famous unsolved mysteries. Those with more seniority even remembered stories passed down about the chaotic first day when Grace vanished and how the entire scene was disturbed before modern standard procedures existed. BPD immediately submitted a supplemental verification request to the lab, matching Lila's DNA against both Grace's father and mother's profiles to rule out any error. The lab reran the full comparison in kinship test format, and results returned within hours. The match between Lila's DNA and Elaine Howard's reached near absolute threshold, consistent with a mother-child relationship. This result eliminated all remaining doubts. There was no longer any question Lila Maddox was Grace Howard. Once scientific verification was complete, BPD began the cold case reactivation process. Per regulations, the case was removed from passive storage and shifted to active investigation, priority flag status, as finding a missing child after more than 3 decades required comprehensive review of all details, including the journey, the identity of the abductor, and any factors related to long-term concealment. The first step in reactivation was reviewing all 1977 investigative data, scene diagrams, assessments of the soil slide at the fence, the red fiber, the 3 to 6 second unsupervised timeline, descriptions of the denim-clad man and the woman by the van, the list of screened vehicles, and the elimination of Ethan Markley. Everything was brought back to the analysis table. Investigators began rereading every statement page, every hastily written note from the night Grace vanished, every conclusion that led to the case being frozen. From a modern perspective, many weaknesses in the original investigation became clear, issues that at the time lacked tight procedures to prevent. An internal notification was sent department-wide, case #7704H, officially reopened. All leads prior considered inactive now reevaluated. Immediate review required. Simultaneously, BPD notified the district attorney's office to prepare documents for potential prosecution if the reopened investigation identified any individuals directly or indirectly responsible. Reactivating the case was not mere procedure. It marked the start of a chain of actions to reconstruct what happened to Grace after she was taken, why she was cut off from society, and the true identity of those who concealed her real name. At the same time, BPD contacted DHS and CPS to report the DNA results and request coordination in protecting and handling Lila's file, now identified as the victim of a decades-long abduction. Within hours, the official notification was issued. After more than 34 years, the Grace Howard case had achieved its biggest breakthrough since the day it occurred. The case was no longer frozen, it was fully reopened, with the task of re-examining everything missed in 1977. From witnesses, evidence, vehicles, to every minor detail in the original investigation. For the first time in decades, the Grace Howard file no longer stopped at the question, "Where did the little girl go?" but shifted to the more critical question, what happened during all the time she was missing? Immediately after the Grace Howard case was reactivated, and DNA verification confirmed that Lila Maddox was the child missing since 1977. The Bend Police Department began re-examining all old physical evidence, including the small samples stored in cold case archives for over 3 decades. Original documentation noted very little evidence collected due to severe scene contamination in the initial hours, but those remaining fragments now became the focus of analysis because modern forensic technology could process traces that were completely unexploitable in 1977. First on the list was the red fiber recovered from the right backyard fence, a sample so small that at the time it was only labeled unidentified fiber and could not be further analyzed. In the original file, the fiber was described simply as red, approximately 1 centimeter long, thin, type undetermined. No equipment in 1977 allowed DNA extraction from such small fiber material, nor was there basis to determine if it belonged to Grace's clothing or someone else's. When the case was reopened, the forensic team transferred the old fiber sample to a modern lab for analysis under next-generation DNA standards. Opening the evidence envelope was done under strictly controlled conditions. Forensic staff documented every action to ensure no cross-contamination risk after years in storage. When the fiber was placed under a high-powered microscope, the analysis team quickly identified it as old-generation polyester synthetic structure, commonly used in 1970s children's clothing. However, the most critical aspect was not the material, but the extremely small skin cell layer adhering to the fiber end, traces invisible to the naked eye, but potentially a DNA source under modern technology. The sample was processed using micro-extraction technique to isolate remaining DNA molecules. After hours of extraction and amplification, a partial DNA profile was generated from the cells on the fiber. The matching results showed high compatibility with Lila's, i.e. Grace's, DNA. This not only confirmed that Grace had contacted the right fence, but also indicated that the red fiber was not random debris falling into the area after adults searched. It was genuine scene evidence with legal value. This prompted the investigation team to revisit the 1977 scene map. Grace was last seen in the front yard, but the fiber appeared on the right backyard fence, over 10 feet from the final position. If the fiber belonged to Grace, it meant she had contacted or been pulled close to the right fence at the time of disappearance, completely contrary to the initial hypothesis that she was only near the front steps. Next, the forensic team reanalyzed the soil slide mark, a trace noted at the time, but deemed unclear due to scene disturbance. Original documentation described the slide as approximately 8 inches long, irregular shape, located close to the right fence. Photos of the slide were stored fairly clearly, though 1970s photo quality was low. Using modern 3D reconstruction software, forensic experts magnified depth, soil compression, and concluded the slide could have been created by a light object being dragged or quickly placed and lifted, not an adult footprint, and not matching a child's foot. When cross-referenced with the red fiber results, the analysis team recognized a possibility never considered in 1977. Someone may have held or touched Grace near the right fence, possibly lifting or pressing her against it for seconds before carrying her to a vehicle or another direction. The soil slide compression was not strong enough for adult weight, but could result from Grace's clothing or items during movement. When synthesized, the two initially undervalued pieces of evidence, a fiber and an unclear slide, combined into consistent indication that Grace and her abductor had contact with the right fence, not the area near the steps where Lydia last saw her. This forced the investigation team to revisit the entire original scene diagram. At the same time, BPD cross-checked 1977 witness statements to determine possible actual movement sequence. Lydia's statement said she only turned her back for a few seconds, and Grace was in the front yard area. But if Grace or her abductor contacted the right fence, it meant the movement happened very quickly, within 3 to 6 seconds, and in a direction out of Lydia's line of sight. The team also re-examined Mr. Palmer's and Mrs. Jensen's statements. The new DNA data led them to reconsider that the two witnesses described different phases of the abduction. Mr. Palmer may have seen the subject before the action, while Mrs. Jensen saw the woman by the van in the later phase. When Grace had been moved near the parking area, Lydia's statement about the man standing at the street end was re-evaluated. If the actual abductor approached from the right fence side, that position was near an exit where a vehicle could park unnoticed from the Howard house direction. The red fiber matching Grace's DNA also refuted the initial assumption that Grace was only near the steps when she vanished. The evidence indicated she was at the right fence during the critical moment. This forced the team to reopen details overlooked in the initial night, a narrow strip between the right fence and the neighbor's garage, previously deemed unimportant, but now a key point. Upon reanalyzing this position, the team realized it was a blind spot undetectable from the front yard where Lydia stood, especially in low light. The combination of the red fiber, soil slide, and blind spot fence corner led the team to conclude this was most likely the direct contact point between Grace and her abductor. Finally, the team reviewed a piece of evidence completely overlooked in 1977, a very small wood splinter attached to the red fiber. New technology allowed analysis of wood origin by grain and wear level. This wood splinter matched the type of wood in the Howard house's right fence, confirming the fiber snagged exactly at the point Grace contacted or was touched. When piecing all results together, the investigation team concluded that the 1977 evidence, fiber, slide, right fence blind spot not only related but fully matched Grace's DNA, transforming them from unidentified samples into authenticated evidence indicating the victim's movement path and final contact point before leaving the yard. This was the first time in over 30 years that scattered evidence in the old file was connected into a logical chain, opening the possibility of accurately reconstructing Grace's final seconds in Bend. After confirming that the red cloth fiber and the fence traces both matched Grace's DNA, the BPD shifted its focus to the only individual who could explain the entire journey, spanning more than 30 years, Marcia Maddox, who had used a false identity to raise and control Grace under the name Lila Maddox. The first step in the investigation process was to reconstruct Marcia's entire movement history over nearly 4 decades, a task that was extremely complex because Marcia had left almost no official traces, living mostly off the grid, constantly changing locations, and having no stable financial records or employment history. The investigative team began by tracking down Marcia's old addresses based on rental agreements, utility bills, vehicle registrations, and any remaining information in county and state databases. The scattered records only appeared at intermittent points, forming milestones that allowed investigators to piece together her journey. The earliest confirmed point after 1977 was a 1980 rental agreement in the suburbs of Burns, Oregon, under the name Marcia L. Maddox. This timing coincided with the period when Grace's case was moved to cold case status, and since Burns is more than 130 miles from Bend, choosing this remote location fit with someone wanting to avoid detection. In the rental records, there was no mention of accompanying children, but later neighbor statements confirmed that Marcia lived with a little girl around a few years old. From Burns, the investigative team found the next milestone in 1984 in La Pine, where Marcia rented a small log cabin. The rental agreement lasted only 6 months, consistent with the pattern of frequent moves that Grace described as an adult. A suspicious sign during this period was Marcia using 3 addresses in less than a year and never allowing anyone else's name to appear on the paperwork, a way to avoid revealing Grace's existence. From La Pine, Marcia's records disappeared for 4 years, forcing the BPD to trace her through indirect data such as pharmacy records, rare purchase receipts, and cash transactions. A 1986 grocery receipt in Klamath Falls with a matching signature was identified as a soft milestone, not proving Marcia lived there, but indicating she was in the area. The next firm milestone was in 1988 in Crescent, Oregon, where Marcia signed a rental agreement for an old mobile home. Neighbors from that time remembered her as someone who kept to herself, moved secretly, and avoided all questions. One person reported seeing Marcia keep a little girl inside the house for days on end, rarely letting her out. Investigators noted that this description perfectly matched Grace's living conditions during that period. From Crescent, the investigative team followed document trails to 1991, when Marcia moved north and lived near Redmond in a month-to-month rental home. The landlord's notes showed that Marcia paid in cash, had no stable job, and refused any requests for contact information. Additionally, local hospital records from 1992 noted a woman named Marcia Maddox bringing a minor in for treatment but leaving before completing the process because she had no paperwork. Although the procedure was not completed, this was strong evidence that Grace had lived with Marcia in Redmond for more than a year. When cross-referencing the movement timeline with Grace's adult statements, the BPD found that the addresses all aligned with the living pattern she described: constant relocations, avoiding social contact, never staying in one place too long, and always being cautious when someone asked questions. The next step was for the BPD to examine the period from 1994 to 2000. The most difficult to trace because Marcia had almost completely vanished from official records. In the first 3 years, there were no bills, no rental agreements, and no bank transactions in her name. The investigative team had to scour lists of mobile home parks, low-rent housing areas, and scattered rural communities in remote parts of Oregon. An abandoned address in Warm Springs had a rental record under Marcia L., with a matching signature, suggesting she may have lived there in 1996. During this time, many signs indicated that Marcia deliberately used small, sparsely populated communities to conceal Grace's existence, especially since no one in the area clearly remembered a child accompanying her. Continuing the search, the investigative team discovered that Marcia moved to Western Oregon in the late 1990s with an old vehicle registration in Florence in 1998. The handwriting sample in this record matched 3 previous signature samples from rental agreements. A landlord in Florence stated that Marcia lived with a shy young girl who never went outside, information that aligned with the period when Grace was entering her teenage years. When analyzing behavior, the BPD noted that the Florence period was when social control peaked. Marcia forbade Grace from any outside contact because she feared Grace would attract attention, as she was now old enough to raise suspicions. Entering the 2010 period, Marcia's records became clearer again through rental term notes at 3 locations: Reedsport, Cottage Grove, and areas near Eugene. These addresses closely matched Grace's adult accounts: frequent moves, minimal social interaction, multiple midnight departures, and locations all far from population centers. Cross-referencing suspicious signs by period, the BPD compiled an overall picture of the movement history. Every time Marcia sensed a risk of discovery, whether from a medical worker asking for paperwork, a curious neighbor, or just the appearance of a strange vehicle, she immediately left and moved to another town. This perfectly aligned with the behavior of someone concealing a victim's identity for decades. When comparing the movement timeline with hospital data from Part 21, the BPD concluded that Grace's injury incident, the first time she was forced to interact with the medical system, had broken the cycle of control that had lasted more than 30 years. Tracing Marcia's movement history allowed investigators to recognize that every decision she made revolved around a central goal: keeping Grace out of reach of the system and the community. The timeline map not only reflected the prolonged concealment journey, but also revealed many suspicious points that could not be explained by normal living, from constantly paying in cash, having no proof of employment, to avoiding all outside contact. All of this became the focus for analysis, opening up the in-depth investigation phase to answer why Grace was taken and how Marcia maintained control over her for 4 decades. Once Marcia Maddox's entire chain of movement history had been reconstructed and the 1977 physical evidence had been rematched with Grace's DNA results, the Bend Police Department proceeded to the most critical step in the reinvestigation process: obtaining an arrest warrant for Marcia on charges of child abduction, identity concealment, and unlawful prolonged detention spanning decades. The arrest warrant was signed by a Deschutes County judge early in the morning, based on the DNA conclusion confirming that Grace Howard was alive, evidence of Marcia maintaining control over her off the grid, and the movement history chain matching the time Grace disappeared. A small BPD task force coordinated with Eugene Police to execute the arrest at the temporary rental home, where Marcia and Grace had lived before the accident forced Leila to be hospitalized. The approach took place at 5 a.m. to minimize the risk of Marcia escaping or destroying evidence. Officers surrounded the house, knocked on the door, and read the arrest warrant as Marcia stepped out in a confused state, not having time to react. When they mentioned the name Grace Howard, Marcia's body tensed completely, and she fell completely silent, as if all the layers of cover she had built over more than 30 years collapsed in an instant. She did not resist, but her eyes shifted from anxiety to fear as she was handcuffed and placed in the patrol car. Immediately upon arriving at the interrogation room, the questioning process began in multiple rounds, with a slow, detailed strategy aimed at peeling away each layer of information Marcia had hidden for decades. In the first interrogation round, Marcia maintained a defensive attitude, insisting that Leila Maddox was her daughter and saying, "There is no one named Grace Howard in my life." The investigators did not argue immediately, but let her present the entire story she wanted to maintain. However, when they placed the DNA file on the table, along with genetic comparisons proving the mother-daughter relationship between Grace and Elaine Howard, Marcia avoided looking at the documents and began to tremble slightly. When the investigators asked again, "Do you know that the girl you call Leila is actually Grace Howard, missing since 1977?" Marcia was silent for nearly a minute, then replied in a low voice, "I don't know what you're talking about." In the second interrogation round, the investigators shifted to a timeline confrontation strategy. They presented Marcia's 40-year movement map, along with neighbor statements, rental documents, and milestones showing she repeatedly left locations whenever there was a risk of community contact. When the investigators emphasized the period she lived in Burns in 1980, Lapine in 1984, and Crescent in 1988, Marcia began breathing rapidly, a sign she was under psychological pressure. When they asked why she often moved at night, Marcia tried to say she just didn't like neighbors, but this explanation did not fit the unstable movement pattern they had analyzed. The third interrogation round was conducted after giving Marcia a short break, then returning with a strategy focused on behavior. They did not ask about Grace immediately, but about Leila, how she raised her, why she never let the child go to school, had no paperwork, no friends, and was always kept inside the house. As the investigators listed each controlling behavior, locking doors, drawing curtains, restricting communication, forbidding use of documents, Marcia did not refute, but only looked down at the table. When they asked, "Does a normal child live like that?" Marcia bit her lip and avoided eye contact. In the fourth interrogation round, the investigators asked direct questions. "How did you take the little girl out of Bend?" For the first time, Marcia reacted strongly, saying, "I didn't kidnap anyone, I just did what needed to be done." When asked what needed to be done meant, she fell silent. The investigators used this pause to open the 1977 crime scene photo file, pointing to the red cloth fiber and the ground skid marks, evidence that for more than 3 decades no one knew was connected. They said, "We know you were near the right fence. The DNA confirms it." This was the moment Marcia clearly showed wavering. She stared at the photo of the right fence, her eye twitching slightly, then replied in a low voice, "It's not like you think." When asked to explain like what, she said nothing more. The fifth interrogation round focused on the relationship between Marcia and Grace. The investigators asked, "What were you afraid of if you took the girl to the hospital? Why did you never let her access school?" For the first time, Marcia showed anger, slamming her hand on the table and saying, "I was protecting her. I was the only one protecting her." This reaction indicated she did not view her actions as an abduction, but as a form of salvation, a common trait in profiles of prolonged abductions and victim control. When the investigators probed deeper, protecting from whom, Marcia did not answer. In the sixth interrogation round, the turning point, the investigators presented the DNA evidence matching mother and daughter between Grace and Elaine Howard. When they placed the blood relation confirmation document in front of Marcia and said, "There's no other way to explain it. This isn't Leila Maddox. "This is Grace Howard. You took her." Marcia finally slumped her shoulders, her eyes leaving the document, and replied in an almost whisper, "I knew." That moment was the first time during the entire interrogation that Marcia stopped denying. When the investigators asked, "Do you admit to taking Grace Howard out of Bend in 1977?" she slowly nodded, but added, "I didn't kidnap her. I saved her." This statement opened a series of questions about motive, but most importantly, it was the first time in more than 30 years that Marcia directly acknowledged taking Grace away from the Howard family. Although she did not describe details, this confirmation was enough for the BPD to record in the minutes, "Suspect acknowledges taking victim from Bend, Oregon, in 1977." After the admission, the investigators continued requesting specific descriptions of events. Marcia remained silent to the point that they had to ask step by step, "Where did you encounter Grace? How did you take her away? Was anyone else involved?" Marcia only answered briefly, "I was alone," and when asked about approaching Grace, she replied, "The opportunity came, and I had to do it." Though the answer was vague, it was still an indirect admission that the taking occurred suddenly in the moment Lydia turned away. At the end of the interrogation session, one investigator asked, "Do you regret it?" Marcia did not answer, only looking down at her handcuffed hands and saying, "I only did what I believed was right." Although this was not a full confession, it affirmed that she acted with intent and maintained the behavior for decades, paving the way for subsequent investigative steps. The interrogation concluded with the finding, Marcia Maddox was officially recorded as the person who took Grace Howard from Bend in 1977 and maintained the detention behavior until 2011. The first time in the case file that a direct admission appeared from the very person who did it, after Marcia Maddox admitted in the interrogation room that she had taken Grace Howard out of Bend in 1977, the Bend Police Department shifted to a critical but more ethical task than investigation. Fully exonerating Ethan Markley, who had been suspected in the early days of the disappearance, and for decades afterward, continued to be viewed as the man who might know something, even though there had never been any concrete evidence. What Marcia confessed, that she acted alone, that she directly approached Grace and took her away in the moment Lydia was distracted, was enough to completely rule out any possibility of Ethan's involvement. However, under legal procedure, BPD still had to complete all alibi verification processes, cross-referencing every timeline point from 1977 with the current confession, new DNA evidence, reanalyzed physical evidence, and Marcia's entire travel history to ensure no lingering doubts remained regarding Ethan. First, the cold case team recompared Ethan's timeline with the actual events confirmed from the 1977 findings and Marcia's admission. The time of Grace's disappearance was determined to have occurred between 6:38 and 6:44 p.m. Ethan stated that he was at home during that window, and no evidence had ever proven he left the house, nor were there any witnesses who saw him near Alder Lane. When cross-referenced with the new findings showing the abduction took place in the blind spot of the right fence, an area Ethan could not access in a short time, the investigative team concluded that geographically he could not have committed the act in the few seconds described. Additionally, the reanalysis of the red fabric fiber and the skid marks showed that Grace came into contact with the right fence in a way that only matched the actions of a perpetrator standing right there in direct access. When compared to Ethan's height, reach, and home location in 1977, the investigators confirmed that he could not have been near the fence at that moment without being seen by nearby residents. At the same time, Marcia's immediate departure from Bend in a dark-colored van, described by two witnesses on the night Grace disappeared, also ruled out the possibility that the vehicle belonged to Ethan, as he did not own a similar vehicle, and his vehicle history from 1977 showed nothing matching the description. Next, BPD re-examined the old polygraph results, which had been deemed inconclusive. With the current data, the investigator reassessed Ethan's anxious responses in the context of the time, He was the primary suspect in one of Ben's biggest cases, subjected to intense questioning, while being naturally shy and anxious. Failing the polygraph was no longer indirect evidence, but was determined to be a normal reaction from someone placed under unreasonable pressure. When cross-referenced with his decades of silence and lack of any flight behavior or signs of concealment, BPD concluded that Ethan had never had the motive, opportunity, or means to commit the kidnapping. Afterward, the investigative team contacted Washington State Police to cross-check timelines when Ethan moved there in the early 1980s. There was no unusual behavior, no criminal record, no indications of involvement in any child disappearances. His medical records, employment history, and residency history were all normal, with nothing suggesting he had ever hidden a child. When piecing together all the data, timeline, physical evidence, Marcia's confession, vehicle history, spatial analysis of the scene, and DNA analysis, the cold case investigators reached the final conclusion. Ethan had never been involved in the kidnapping of Grace Howard. After completing the conclusion, BPD held a small press conference at headquarters. The head of the cold case unit officially stated, "Based on the DNA evidence and current confession, we affirm that Mr. Ethan Markley is completely innocent and has no connection whatsoever to the 1977 disappearance of Grace Howard." In a private meeting beforehand, BPD also directly informed Ethan of the investigation's conclusion, the man who had carried the burden of suspicion for over 30 years. Upon hearing the official exoneration, Ethan only bowed his head, remained silent for a long time before saying quietly, "I just wanted people to stop thinking I did something." He did not blame anyone, but the pain from being suspected in the early decade of the investigation was evident in his eyes. Finally, his name was removed from the persons of interest list in the reopened file, and BPD sent a confirmation document for permanent storage in the case file, ensuring that no agency in the future could view him as a suspect or person of interest. This was the first time since 1977 that the official records of the Bend Police Department clearly stated Ethan Markley, cleared. After Ethan Markley was exonerated and his file officially removed from the persons of interest list, the Bend Police Department moved on to a deeply humane task that also required extremely careful procedures, verifying the victim's identity with her biological parents and preparing for their first reunion after 34 years. Although DNA had confirmed that Lila Maddox was Grace Howard, the final verification step still had to be carried out according to legal and psychological protocols to ensure all information was conveyed sensitively, avoiding shock, while preparing the best possible conditions for what could be the most significant event in the lives of both sides. The investigative agency contacted Elaine and Robert Howard, now both elderly, to inform them that their daughter's cold case file had taken a major turn. When receiving the call from BPD, Elaine initially thought it was just another routine update, the kind that over decades she had heard sorry, no progress, so often it had become a painful habit. But this time, the investigator's voice was different from before. He asked them to come to BPD headquarters for an in-person discussion, saying the information could change everything. Elaine looked at Robert, her hand trembling, while he set the phone down in silence, as if sensing something was about to change after more than 30 years. When the Howards arrived at headquarters, they were led into a private meeting room. The cold case investigator spread out the case files on the table, but did not jump straight to the point. He began by reviewing the DNA results, the matching process, the match level, and the fact that there was no longer any possibility of error. Elaine gripped Robert's hand tightly, her eyes fixed on the pages, as if afraid that blinking would make everything in front of her disappear. When the investigator said, "We have found Grace. She is alive," Elaine covered her mouth, her whole body shaking violently, while Robert sat motionless, eyes wide open but unable to speak. The words they had waited 34 years for, the words they hardly dared believe could happen, suddenly became reality. The investigator explained that Grace was currently in a CPS protective facility, in stable health, receiving care after the medical incident, and that she had lived under the name Lila Maddox for decades without knowing her true identity. Elaine began sobbing uncontrollably, a cry that was both bursting and choked, while Robert placed both hands on his face, trying to stay calm but unable to stop his rapid breathing. When they asked, "Does she know about us?" the investigator said that Grace did not yet know the full truth, because CPS wanted to proceed step by step to avoid overwhelming her psychologically. BPD and CPS decided that the first meeting needed to be prepared according to protocols for reunions after long-term disappearances. Before the reunion took place, CPS's team of psychologists and a victim support specialist were assigned to work with Grace, explaining each piece of information in the most accessible way possible. Through multiple sessions, they shared that her past was not what she had been told, that Lila Maddox was only a name used for part of her life, and that her true identity was Grace Howard. When hearing that name for the first time, Grace did not react immediately. She bowed her head, looked down at her hands, and said it was a strange name, but familiar in some weird way. The psychologist told her that her biological family was still alive and waiting to meet her. Grace did not respond, only remained silent for a long time, then asked a simple but heavy question, "Do they know I was taken?" The specialist replied that they had been searching for her for over 30 years. In the following days, CPS helped Grace view old photos, Howard family pictures from the 1970s, her third birthday photos, pictures of her playing in the yard. At first, Grace just looked silently, but by the fourth photo, she gently touched the face of the woman in the picture, much younger Elaine, and whispered, "I think I remember this person." This was a signal that Grace was ready to move to the next stage, the first meeting with her biological parents. BPD and CPS coordinated to choose the reunion location. They decided not to hold it at the police headquarters, but in a private activity room at a state victim support facility, where the space was warmer and less interrogative. Before the meeting, Grace was guided on what might happen, that her parents could be highly emotional, that no one expected her to remember everything immediately, and that all her actions would be respected, with no one forcing her to react in any particular way. Meanwhile, Elaine and Robert were also guided by specialists on how to approach without overwhelming Grace, not hugging too tightly unless she initiated, not asking much about the missing years, not expressing anger in front of her, and most importantly, letting her lead the pace of the meeting. On the day of the reunion, Elaine and Robert arrived at the facility very early. Elaine brought a small box. Inside was the red plastic bracelet Grace had worn back then, the only thing they had kept from her room the day she disappeared. Robert stood beside his wife, hands clasped together, constantly looking toward the door, as if afraid that if he didn't watch, he would miss the moment his daughter walked in. When Grace arrived, she stood outside the door for a few seconds, breathing unevenly. The door opened, and Elaine nearly collapsed when she saw the woman standing before her, an adult, but still with the eyes of the 5-year-old girl from years ago. Grace stood still, hands clenched tightly, unsure what to do. Elaine walked slowly toward her, but stopped at a safe distance, tears streaming down her face, and only said one sentence almost in a whisper, "You are Mommy's Grace." Grace covered her mouth, momentarily stunned, as if unable to believe it was real. Then she took a small step toward Elaine. Eyes red, voice trembling, "I don't know what to say." Elaine shook her head, her hands trembling as she reached out, but not touching Grace unless she initiated. The moment lasted a few seconds, then Grace took another step forward and allowed Elaine to hug her. Sobs erupted from both sides, a choked but liberating cry, after more than 30 years of loss and waiting. Robert stepped forward, placing his hand on his daughter's shoulder, trying to speak, but unable to. When Grace turned to him, he could only manage 2 words, "Hello, sweetheart." The three hugged each other in a time no one could measure. A moment both strange and familiar, both painful and healing. After they sat down, Elaine opened the small box and showed Grace the plastic bracelet. Grace took it, her fingers trembling as they traced the surface, A tiny image but enough to awaken memories she thought were completely gone. "Did I wear this?" she asked. Elaine nodded, tears falling. Grace looked at the bracelet for a few more seconds, then clutched it tightly in her hand, as if it were a small thread reconnecting two lives separated for too long. The meeting lasted many hours, not with rushed stories but with moments of silence, small questions, tentative smiles, and eyes recognizing each other. No one tried to heal everything in one day. All three understood that this was only the beginning. But the reunion had happened, something no one dared be certain would occur over 34 years. And it opened the door to an entirely new journey, where past and present could finally touch after a lifetime apart. After the deeply emotional first reunion between Grace and her biological parents, the Bend Police Department, Oregon CPS, and the victim support team began the next critical phase: social reintegration and legal restoration of identity for Grace Howard, who had lived more than 30 years under the name Lila Maddox, without any records tying her to the U.S. legal or social system. The first and most urgent step was restoring her true identity. Since Grace had never been issued a social security number after being taken in 1977, authorities had to rebuild her entire records from scratch, based on the original birth certificate and DNA results for verification. CPS submitted a request to Oregon Vital Records to reopen the original birth certificate copy for Grace Howard, using archived information along with the long-frozen missing child case code. This process took a few weeks, but as a special case, the state agency expedited and prioritized it. When the birth certificate copy was reissued, Grace held in her hands for the first time in over 3 decades a legal document proving her existence. Afterward, the Federal Social Security Administration accepted the file and proceeded to issue a new Social Security number for Grace. This was a crucial step, because without a Social Security number, she could not register for employment, access medical care, open a bank account, or handle any adult life procedures. When receiving the new SSN card, Grace held it for a long time, staring at the line Grace Elaine Howard, as if trying to believe this was truly her name, the name she had lost more than half her life reclaiming. Alongside identity registration, Grace was enrolled in intensive psychological therapy tailored for long-term control victims. Experts assessed that she had experienced a form of prolonged psychological captivity, with many symptoms similar to victims deprived of autonomy from an early age. Difficulty establishing personal boundaries, reflexive fear when asked about the past, confusion in making decisions, and a tendency to depend on others' opinions because she had never been allowed to decide anything for herself. The therapy sessions were designed on a gradual recovery model, initially examining habits imposed by Marcia, such as sitting near the door to listen for sounds, avoiding strangers, not standing near windows or bowing her head when passing crowds. The therapist helped Grace recognize that these reactions were consequences of control, not her inherent nature. Through each session, Grace learned to stand straighter during conversations, practice eye contact, and gradually understand that no one had the right to decide where she could go or whom she could meet. One of the most important steps was alleviating guilt, something many long-term abduction victims carry into adulthood. Grace repeatedly asked in therapy whether she was wrong for not trying to escape, or whether she had betrayed Marcia by cooperating with CPS. The specialist took considerable time to help her understand that full responsibility lay with the person who controlled and deceived her, that she was a victim and not an accomplice, and that what she endured was never her choice. While Grace received support to readjust to society, the Howard family also needed assistance to recalibrate relationships severed for so long. Elaine and Robert had lived more than 30 years in regret, grief, and imagining a 5-year-old child taken from their arms. Now Grace was an adult woman nearing 40, carrying fragmented memories and invisible traumas. To avoid pressuring either side, family specialists organized meetings in stages, starting with short supported sessions, then gradually increasing time as both sides felt more comfortable. Elaine always wanted to protect Grace like a child, but specialists guided her that what Grace needed was not overprotection, but space to rediscover herself. Robert was more reserved, afraid of scaring his daughter or making her feel obligated to make up for the lost years. In family sessions, they talked about the smallest things, foods Grace liked, habits she had, while with Marcia, things she wanted to learn, places she wanted to live. From there, they slowly rebuilt a connection, not based on broken memories, but on the present reality. Additionally, Grace was guided on basic life skills she had never had the chance to learn: how to use a bank account, schedule medical appointments, use public transportation, find suitable work without qualification, and recognize healthy relationships, something she had never experienced under Marcia's control. BPD and CPS coordinated to ensure that during this phase, Grace was not directly approached by the media to avoid additional pressure. All case-related information was controlled to protect her psychological stability. The entire reintegration roadmap was built on a single goal: helping Grace live as an individual with full control over her life, after more than 30 years of having that right stripped away. Gradually, Grace learned to use her real name more naturally. At first, she signed documents with a trembling hand, hesitating between the familiar Lila and the still strange Grace. But over time, the signature Grace Howard became more confident, clearer, as if her true identity was gradually returning to her. When looking at the newly issued ID card, the first time in her life she had a photo and name matching her real self, Grace said she felt like "I'm finally allowed to exist." Though a long journey still lay ahead, restoring her identity, receiving therapy support, and adjusting family relationships had laid the foundation for Grace's new life. A life she could finally step into with her own name, rather than the one imposed on her for more than 3 decades of loss. Even though Grace had been found and her identity confirmed, the Bend Police Department's reinvestigation process still left some questions that could not be fully answered, gaps that emerged from the evening in 1977 and persisted for over 3 decades, now becoming the remaining part of the case file. The first major question concerned the man in denim that Mr. Palmer saw standing near the end of Alder Lane on the afternoon Grace disappeared. His statement at the time described a man of average build, with brown hair, wearing an old denim jacket, standing next to a dark-colored vehicle. After Marcia was arrested, police questioned her again about the possibility of someone else being present on Alder Lane before or during the time she took Grace, but Marcia completely denied it. She insisted she was alone and had no interaction with any stranger. However, Marcia's confidence in her denial only made the BPD more puzzled. The image of the man in denim did not fit any of her descriptions and did not match any addresses or movements in Marcia's 40-year history. Some investigators believed this could simply be an unrelated passerby, but that argument did not explain why Mr. Palmer saw this person right during the time frame when Grace vanished. The second issue was the actual brown van that appeared in Mrs. Jensen's statement. She described a dark-colored boxy vehicle, possibly a 1970 Sierra van model, parked awkwardly on the shoulder of Highway 7 near the sparse woods. Marcia did not own any van in the vehicle records obtained from subsequent years, and there was no evidence that she had ever purchased or rented one. During interrogation, she continued to insist that on that night she walked into Alder Lane and left in a vehicle, left ready nearby, but she did not specifically describe who had left the car there or how she had the keys. This opened up the possibility of a second vehicle not owned by Marcia. However, because so much time had passed and the vehicle was never found, police could not verify who the brown van truly belonged to, or whether it was directly related to the abduction or simply a vehicle that happened to be there and was linked to the event by the witness due to the timing coincidence. The third question was one that many had suspected from the beginning: whether Marcia had an accomplice. It was possible for her alone to approach Grace in a few seconds, but abducting a child in an instant, leaving Bend that night, and maintaining the concealment for over 30 years led some investigators to question whether someone provided initial support, such as preparing the vehicle, providing an initial hiding place, or logistical assistance. Nevertheless, all the data collected over 40 years, including rental records, witnesses, timeline analysis, and physical evidence, pointed to no presence of a second person. The gaps in Marcia's statements could stem from memory confusion or deliberate attempts to conceal the vehicle's origin, but there was no solid evidence sufficient to conclude the existence of an accomplice. The BPD had to note this possibility in the file as not ruled out but unproven. The final issue involved facts that could not be verified due to the passage of too much time and the heavy disturbance of the 1977 scene. Footprints, tire tracks, and initial directions of movement could not be reconstructed with modern technology because the original data no longer existed. Many statement records lacked details, were vague, or contradictory due to the initial panic among Alder Lane residents. Small pieces of evidence like clumps of dirt on the fence, flattened grass patches, and wood fragments that had been overlooked were reanalyzed, but too many samples had lost value due to prolonged storage. Some basic questions: how many seconds it took to get Grace into the vehicle, from which direction Marcia approached, whether Grace cried out or not, could not be answered with absolute certainty. The only explanations came from Marcia's fragmented admissions, but her accounts always lacked details, were sometimes contradictory, and sometimes stopped at "I don't remember." Even the starting point of the process, why Marcia appeared on Alder Lane on that exact day, remained beyond verification, as she never answered this question with the necessary clarity. When compiling all the data from the past and present, the Grace Howard case file was concluded with two distinct points. One resolved, the victim had been found, and the perpetrator arrested, and one forever open. The chain of small vague details that could not be recollected after 34 years, those lying in the gray area between human memory and traces lost to time. Although the investigation had closed its most important part, the remainder of the case still contained questions without perfect answers and perhaps never would. When the Grace Howard file was closed with the victim found and the perpetrator in custody, the Bend Police Department conducted a final evaluation to identify necessary improvements for the missing child investigation system. This report highlighted the most critical error in the initial process. The 1977 scene was severely contaminated in just the first few minutes, preventing many traces from being reconstructible, even though modern DNA technology had opened new possibilities. This conclusion led to the development of a new missing child response protocol for the entire Deschutes County. Key changes implemented included requiring immediate scene lockdown in all cases of unexplained child disappearances, deploying Key 9 units and helicopters simultaneously rather than sequentially, mandating documentation of every footprint, tire track, and last seen location within 5 minutes, and creating a field map before allowing family or volunteers to search. The new protocol emphasized that the first few minutes could determine the entire outcome 34 years later, a lesson drawn directly from the Grace case. The second point in the evaluation focused on the role of DNA in resolving cold cases. A simple buccal swab from an unidentified victim unlocked a decades-frozen file, demonstrating the value of preserving even tiny evidence and updating family DNA over time. BPD recommended mandatory DNA collection from relatives in every missing child case, from the time of reporting, and updating samples as new technology emerged. They also proposed that cold cases undergo periodic DNA reviews, especially as the CODIS system expanded and connected more states. The Grace case was clear proof that a seemingly unsolvable case could still be resolved through scientific progress. This led BPD and federal agencies to expand DNA matching programs for homeless individuals, undocumented persons, or unidentified victims to prevent prolonged hidden cases like Grace's from remaining in the dark. The final part of the report assessed the long-term impact on the Bend community, where the Grace case had become a collective wound for over 3 decades. In the late 1970s, Bend was a peaceful town where residents still allowed children to play outside without strict supervision. When Grace disappeared, fear spread, the community questioned its own safety, and trust in the system's protective ability was lost. The event left a mark on multiple generations, becoming a story retold whenever a disappearance occurred in the Northwest region. Now, with Grace's return, the Bend community witnessed the relief they once thought would never come, but also faced the reality that the process took too long due to initial procedural limitations. Many Alder Lane residents, most of whom have since moved away, were re-interviewed during the reinvestigation, and they said the guilt of not seeing anything or not being able to do anything had haunted them for years. Finding Grace helped them heal somewhat, but it also affirmed the importance of preparing a rapid response system to avoid repeating old mistakes. The long-term impact was also evident in the cultural shift in how the Bend community viewed missing children and public safety. Community education programs, child search training sessions, and cooperation between police and neighbors have now become the norm rather than the exception. From schools to community centers, Grace's story is incorporated as a lesson in vigilance, perseverance, and the necessity of trusting forensic science. In concluding the report, BPD noted that the Grace Howard case was one of the few cold cases fully resolved after more than 30 years, and that this story not only brought reunion to one family, but also changed the operational structure of the entire county's investigation system. The case became clear evidence that DNA science, combined with strict scene handling procedures and persistence in retaining even the smallest evidence, could rewrite the outcome of a case thought to have sunk into the past. And more importantly, it reminded Ben that no matter how long time stretches, the truth still has a way to return. In the story of Grace Howard, what touches deepest is not only the tragedy of a child taken from her family in a few brief seconds, but also the powerful reminder of the vulnerabilities in community and system responses at that time, things that American society today still needs to remember. Neighbors moving spontaneously, the scene being contaminated, police not securing it in time, and the lack of standard procedures for missing children in 1977 caused the search to fall into chaos from the very first minute. Just a red thread and a soil slide mark, evidence overlooked at the time, became the main keys to reconstructing the truth more than 30 years later. This is a direct lesson for today's communities. Every detail matters, and the initial response from citizens can completely determine the chance of finding a missing child. The story also clearly shows the value of DNA and modern forensic technology in solving cold cases. Grace being found through a simple buccal swab demonstrates why the United States today needs to continue expanding the CODIS system, updating DNA samples from relatives of missing children, and preserving even the smallest evidence. In reality, many American families, especially in minority communities or rural areas, do not know they can proactively provide DNA samples to aid investigation. Grace's story proves that doing so can completely change the fate of a case. Finally, Grace's reintegration journey highlights the importance of long-term psychological support for victims of control or isolation. Her needing to relearn basic life skills, from social interaction to using her real identity, reflects the reality that many victims in the United States, including human trafficking victims, runaway children, or those raised outside the system, need more than a rescue. They need a strong enough system to help them rebuild their lives from the ground up. In summary, Grace Howard's story reminds us that protecting children is not only the responsibility of police, but of the entire community. That forensic science is not something distant, and that healing requires time, support, and patience. These are practical lessons that any community in the United States can apply right now. Thank you for following the 34-year journey of finding justice and reunion for Grace Howard. If you find it meaningful, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss cases solved through perseverance and the power of community. See you in the next video, where we continue exploring true stories that remind us the truth always finds its way back.